Okay. So I think what we're going to be doing today is watching a documentary that you recommended,
Yes.
and uh, and I think you said to me that this is one of your favorite documentaries, and it's something to do with the 2008 financial crash. Is that right?
Yeah, this is Panic, the Untold Story of the 2008 Financial Crisis. I think it's done by Vice, and it is a really interesting documentary. They interview the three primary people that they talk to are Hank Paulson, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Fed at the time, and oh gosh, I think it's Timothy Geithner, who at the time was the Fed's Reserve Bank of New York president and would become the new chair of the Fed under Obama.
Okay, so I suppose probably a bunch of analysis about
Or
like
excuse
what.
me, I think the new Secretary of the Treasury. Sorry.
Okay. So is it mostly analysis of like what leads up to the crash and the aftermath of it, and just
Mhm.
telling the story?
Yeah, it is a really in-depth sort of coverage of breaking down the crisis as it happened, and what the reaction was, and the process of trying to sort of stem the flow.
Okay. Can you say a little bit about why is it that you like this documentary so much? Like, why is this one of your favorites?
I think it's just a particularly first off, it is a particularly well done documentary just in terms of its production and put together. They have really good people that they talk to. They also talk to, former President George Bush as well as Obama. They talk to a number of different people, and the way that they just go about explaining this thing chronologically is just really fantastic. And I think it provides a lot of insight into just how unprepared um, the federal government was in a lot of ways to this crisis. Um, there are a lot of particular stories as this documentary goes uh, that are really kind of eye opening, I think, into exactly what people's understanding of this crisis was.
Hmm. This sounds like the kind of thing that you would see occasionally from legacy media, but this is not the kind of thing that you almost ever see in alternative media, and I wonder if I don't know if that should affect our opinions about the um, transition of the media landscape away from legacy media and toward alternative media. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about this particular series is that this is part of a series I think called Vice on HBO, which is essentially um, some sort of collaboration between Vice and HBO on doing documentaries, which is really, or and just doing a series of like reportive investigations, which is really interesting.
Okay. Well, are you ready to get started?
Yeah, let me Discord here. There we are.
All right, looks good. Interesting that this starts on 9/11.
Nice to see you. Had a good news.
Hmm.
Thanks for coming. All the usual suspects.
Okay, I never
Pretty good
even thought about
concentration of
that.
talent.
You're in the middle of the China mess now? Oh, yeah, I'm in the middle of the China mess. I'm going back and forth on that. It is a mess.
Professor, Tycoon, Tycoon.
Yeah, I got it. How are you? It's nice and smooth. Can you imagine putting different administrations,
I know, it's amazing.
different parties together? And Franklin Roosevelt told Herbert Hoover, he said,
see you in
Go
March.
fuck yourself. Yeah. Exactly. Great.
So how come I got Paul Giamatti to play me and you got Billy Crudup or somebody?
I changed my view after going through all this about housing. It's hard to keep people in their homes, if they can't afford to stay in their home.
This dinner is a remarkable moment. It brought together all of the players from the financial crisis of 2008, the people who were actually in the room, in the moment, to have a conversation about what 2008 and what went wrong.
Things like that.
In the 2008 financial panic, there's no playbook for this stuff. There's no roadmap. There's no instruction manual on what to do.
We're trying to think of the most hated moment in the crisis.
Yeah, there was a lot of candidates.
I think the most hated program was AIG, by far.
But when you think about this group of people, Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and Tim Geithner, and you think about their different experiences, their sensibility, how they approach life.
Oh my God.
In Hank, you have the deal maker. His word is his bond. If he says he's good for something, he's good for it.
We've come up with a whole bunch of policies which are about jobs and growth.
Ben Bernanke, he was an economics professor at Princeton. He'd spent his whole career thinking about and studying the Great Depression. He was built for this moment.
I have a research paper that I'm giving on Thursday at the Brookings Papers fall meeting on the crisis.
And then there's Tim Geithner.
Come up to the top.
You know, some people thought he looked too young for the job, or he looked like he worked on Wall Street. But he was a government guy. He had spent his whole career in government working on global financial panics.
I remember McConnell saying to me in January, we're against almost everything you're doing, and we're going to fight you on all of it, and it's working for us.
It's pretty remarkable to think about how they came together and what ultimately happened. The 2008 financial crisis was far beyond the confines of Wall Street. The good news is that the economy rebounded. The bad news is how the public understands and thinks about what happened. Because of the financial crisis, today there's distrust in government, there's distrust in big institutions, there's distrust in this idea of elites. It has led to the populism that we see in our politics today.
I've heard you
It's a
say
straight line.
that same opinion before. I suppose that means you found it pretty convincing.
Yeah, I think that the financial crisis, and then also, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and the failures of the Bush administration in particular, are really, really like the bedrock for a lot of the populism that we see today. I mean, whenever you have, I think a debate with someone where you're trying to talk about, this that the government has said that this is going to happen. Almost like it's almost a free spot in bingo that person would be like, oh, just like they said there were WMDs in Iraq. No matter what the claim is, you could be talking about like almost anything, and if it's a claim that they don't like, that was made by the government, they're gonna say, oh, like the WMDs in Iraq or things like this.
So it makes a lot of sense that if that's the case, then that would lead to a lot of the kind of conspiratorial thinking that we see in running rampant today. That if people feel like they can't trust authority and they can't trust the information that's given to them, then they're just gonna run wild with.
Yep.
One
Yeah.
other. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think this is like sometimes a real blind spot on the left, where I think some people don't want to acknowledge that there is this train of conspiratorial thought sometimes on like the left, especially the more progressive left. Like I think that like if you look at like people who sometimes talk about how like Bernie Sanders had like the Democratic primary in 2016 or in 2020 rigged against him, there's a lot of, I think, parallels there, and I don't think it's an accident that Donald Trump in both elections would sometimes play on this one and be like, Bernie, they cheated him and stuff like this.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One other thing they said that I think was noteworthy was they were saying something about how like the 2008 crisis was unprecedented, or there's no playbook for how to handle it, and I think That's maybe just slightly an exaggeration because of course we've had financial crises before, and they even mentioned the Great Depression, and we've had many recessions since then. So we do have some precedent for how to handle it. But nevertheless, I think the point that they're making mostly stands because we're dealing with an event that for which there's a small sample size, and in
Yeah.
statistics, that's a really big deal. Like if this is something that has only happened in modern economies. Like, there's only been one other time when it was as severe, and then, probably still 10 other times when a less severe version of it happened. We really don't have good quality data on how to study what are the most effective ways to combat it. And of course, we can't really do like a science experiment that to understand these things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's a classic problem where you just can't run experiments on these kinds of things. All right, America, this year we're gonna run a financial crisis and see and see if what happens when we take this response.
and,
And
and
and I think the other thing is, or sorry, you can go ahead.
Oh yeah, and it's even hard to even like if a financial crisis comes along, it's really hard to understand it after the fact because each one happened in different circumstances. So and
Yep.
there's so many different factors that you can attribute that it's really hard to kind of isolate the variables, so to speak.
Yeah. And I think especially the way that this particular financial crisis played out is the other thing that was also very unprecedented, where there was this sort of crisis of confidence in financial institutions that started to ripple out and affect the rest of the economy. And that's what they were mostly concerned with trying to alleviate, is to make sure that like there isn't like almost like a run on the banks and like money stops coming out of ATMs.
Yeah, so that would be like really only in the Great Depression have we seen a thing like that in modern times.
Hmm.
And I don't even know if there's earlier precedents for that, but they would have been at least 100 years ago, if so.
Yeah, certainly not in America.
Yeah, yeah.
Big trouble for millions of American homeowners as a slowing housing market has turned some mortgages into time bombs.
One failed mortgage might not threaten the whole financial system. Millions of them could. 34 subprime mortgage companies have gone bust in just the last few months.
Bear Stearns is hurting. The stock cut in half, investors in general cutting out.
Fannie and Freddie may not have enough money on hand to stay in business.
If you're used to thinking about the issues, it is very intuitive that if you've got a bazooka and people know you've got it, you may not have to take it up.
Bernanke needs to open the discount window. He has no idea how bad it is out there. He has no idea.
The Dow tumbled more than 500 points after two pillars of the street tumbled over the weekend. Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy.
The Dow Industrials finished with their worst one-day point loss in history, down 777 points.
If our nation continues on this course, the economic damage will be painful and lasting.
So this is no longer just a Wall Street crisis, this is an American crisis. And it's the American economy that needs this rescue plan.
How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. President Obama, are you listening?
We are tired of the 1% of the 1% and what they have done to the country, what they've done to the world. Government is finished.
This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Good morning. Welcome to the White House. In the first quarter of 2006, the U.S. economy grew at an annual rate of 5.3%, the fastest growth in 2.5 years. We added 5.2 million new jobs since August of 2003.
When I became chief of staff at the beginning of 2006, the president gave me a mandate to refresh the cabinet. I felt strongly that the president needed a Secretary of the Treasury who was experienced in the markets and whom the markets would respect. And Hank Paulson really stood out He is the leader of Goldman Sachs, perhaps the most successful financial institution in the history of the world at that time.
Josh Bolton, who was the chief of staff to George Bush, called and made a pitch. I talked with people around me, and no one advised me that that was the right thing to do.
First, he said his family would be against it. His wife was a friend and classmate of Hillary Clinton.
My wife, Wendy, clearly didn't want to, and I didn't want to. So I turned it down a couple of times. Wendy's reticence came largely from the work years ago when I was in the White House. I went to the Nixon White House, great sense of timing, 6 weeks before the Watergate break-in. And what Wendy didn't like had to do with the whole political scene. But a few weeks later, they came back. It had occurred to me, the reason I was turning this down was, due to fear of failure. And I tell you, as soon as that hit me, I just reversed on a dime.
Hank came up to the treaty room there in the White House. He was reluctant, but he wanted to serve the country. And I assured him one thing that I think was important to Hank, and that is when he picked up the phone and called me, I'd answer it. In other words, he wouldn't have to battle his way through a lot of layers of staff. He agreed to come, and one of the best decisions I made in my presidency. Good morning, welcome to the White House. I'm pleased to announce that I will nominate Henry Paulson to be the Secretary of the Treasury.
Our economy's strength is rooted in the entrepreneurial spirit and the competitive zeal of the American people, and in our free and open market. It is truly a marvel, but we cannot take it for granted.
I didn't know Hank before he came to Washington. It was customary for the Fed chairman and the Treasury Secretary to meet at least once a week over breakfast or lunch. We both liked oatmeal, so we used to have an oatmeal breakfast either in my dining room or in the Treasury dining room. Hank was a markets person. He had been very successful on Wall Street. He's very high energy. He and I are very different people. I tend to be personally kind of quiet. I was an economics professor, full stop. I liked being an economics professor, and I never expected to be at the Fed or in government. But in 2002, I got a call from the White House. They needed to fill a slot on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve. Would I be interested? I recognized that I had been spending my academic career studying monetary policy and financial markets, and maybe I could put some of that to use. And moreover, it was just a few months after 9/11, and I was kind of feeling that it was important for me to do some public service.
Today, I'm honored to announce that I'm nominating Ben Bernanke to be the next chairman of the Federal Reserve.
You could say Ben was the academic who grew up studying the mistakes made in the Great Depression, why financial systems matter to economies. Hank had spent his life in markets, and I'd spent my life in the policy world really dealing with financial crises.
I first met him when he became the president of the New York Fed. Well, the New York Fed is probably the most important of the 12 Federal Reserve banks, and the president of the New York Fed has traditionally been the Fed's eyes and ears on Wall Street.
I think we all had something in common, which is, anybody who'd grown their life in markets understands that markets aren't always self-correcting. So I think we all shared a view about this tenuous fragility of the system. We really did trust each other.
When I arrived in July of 2006, I thought there was a very good chance that in the 2.5 years I was in Washington, we would be facing a financial crisis. But the things that I was concerned about turned out not to be the biggest problem.
It was March 13th, which happens to be my birthday. I was at Avra, this Greek restaurant down here with my parents, my family. The CEO of Bear Stearns called me. It was maybe 9 o'clock at night and said, Jamie, I need $29 billion before Asia opens or we're gonna have to declare bankruptcy. And I said, Alan, I can't possibly lend you $29 billion overnight.
Bear Stearns, one of the most admired firms in America, now one of the most endangered.
The firm has been buffeted by constant rumors of a looming liquidity problem.
What happened at Bear Stearns was the first true demonstration of what the crisis looked like, because it was a crisis of confidence. Bear Stearns owned a huge piece of the housing business, and they had taken on some of the worst risk. all of a sudden, all sorts of investors on Wall Street said, I don't think that Bear Stearns good for the money. And not only do I not think they're good for the money, I got to get my money out of there immediately.
Bear Stearns is the biggest casualty yet of the nation's mortgage mess.
The company has become a poster boy for the real estate bubble.
We knew that there are excesses in housing, and we missed it totally. Homeownership went, very sadly, from shelter to an investment. When I had joined Goldman Sachs in 1974, the industry was growing in many ways. You saw an evolution in modern finance. You began to see different forms of securitizations.
Mortgage-backed securities really came into being in the 1980s. They started as a really good idea, which made a lot of sense, which was a way to take mortgages, package them up, and sell off the cash flows. So an investor would buy a portion of all these mortgages, and the mortgages would pay that investor. And the idea was that made investing in mortgages much less risky, because instead of investing in just me, you were investing in 1,000 people.
As we moved to securitization, we had cheaper mortgages. If you could afford 20% down, fine. But if you couldn't, let's say you have 5%, let's say you had 1%, let's say you had 0%. We came up with all these ways to get loans to more people. You know, it was certainly felt exciting at the time that we were going to spread the American dream all over the place.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about what the woman said who was on just a moment ago, and about her statement that this is a scheme that's supposed to reduce the risk in handing out mortgages, and I don't know, like that's a really hard thing for me to parse, because what it seems like is you're reducing one type of risk at the expense of increasing a different type of risk, right? Because if you distribute the risk of all the mortgages more broadly, then like in a way, like you're less at risk for the failure of individual mortgages, but you're increasing the risk of like system-wide problems to affect
Yeah.
all of the mortgages, right? Because none of them are operating independently from it. None of them can escape from the system-wide crisis.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I think, the evolution of the mortgage-backed securities and and the sort of aftermarket that evolves from them, is that it was this really good idea that started out where you just like she says, if you are investing in a securitization that's made up of multiple ones, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. But as a result, you're like linking a lot of these baskets together. And then if enough of them start failing, if you get to, a certain percentage of like delinquencies on a mortgage-backed security, then the bond can like start to fail. And then it sort of like becomes this like chain effect.
Yeah, exactly. So Bockel says it was supposed to reduce the risk to the lender, not the borrower, but I'm not entirely convinced that it does either of those. I mean, because it seems like it ended up hurting the lenders as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely went too far. I mean, that was obviously their intent, but yeah, from an investor perspective, these were just being so lucrative that they started to sort of push the envelope, especially because there was this assumption that like housing was very secure, right? It's like, this market won't fail because housing is like such an important thing to lots of people. In order for this market to fail, millions of people would have to not fail to pay their homes. And that was just thought of as this like impossibility. And as a result, the risk was leveraged far greater than like it otherwise would have been.
Oh, okay. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but it's like I don't know, it's like they're gambling the integrity of the entire system on this idea that people defaulting on their mortgages is going to be like uncorrelated with each other, like as if they have to happen independently, and as if there were no systems that in place that
Mhm.
could result in large numbers of people defaulting on their mortgages at once, which just doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense when we live in an economy that's as interconnected as it is.
Mhm. I think this was, and I could be wrong on this, but I think it's also the case that previously regional housing markets in the United States were seen as pretty discorrelated. And this was one of the first instances where you saw a real systemic trend across different housing markets in America. And as a result, that was another sort of assumption or previous like observation that this market was very like reliant on, and when that turned out to not be true, or at least not true anymore, it was disaster. And this is all amplified by just how much further it was leveraged, how far the envelope had been pushed, I think, on the like financial risk, and how much was riding on this industry.
Yeah. So I mean, if there if there is a lesson to take away from all, I'm sure there's lots of lessons to take away from all of this, but one of these should be that the interconnectedness of not only the national economy, but I guess the global economy, right? Because it doesn't seem like that type of risk mitigation strategy actually makes a lot of sense in an economy that's as interconnected as the one that we have.
I think it makes a lot more sense when it's not being pushed to such an or this is a very specific financial conversation that I'm not very well equipped on. But I think the big problem here isn't necessarily that their logic was fundamentally unsound, but that they really pushed it and twisted it in a way that it became unsound. If they had continued, if there had not been such a push to get more and more of these mortgages and degrade the underlying quality, then there wouldn't have been this crisis of confidence that began to ripple out. But because there was this practice of providing mortgages when they should not have been, because they were incredibly profitable to then package up in securities, as a result, they started, these housing bonds became so profitable that they started to push them in such a way that degraded their reliability.
Um, that makes me think about the way that like going back to the point about the way that different people have reacted to the crisis and the way that different people have blamed it on different things. It makes me think about how like we live just because we live in a mixed economy, we have like enough capitalism in our economy that people who want to blame it on capitalism can plausibly do that, but then we also have enough government intervention in our economy that people who want to blame it on government intervention can plausibly do that, and we have enough of all these different things going on in our economy that people can just point fingers in all different directions, and it seems like this interesting kind of like Rorschach test for the way that people bring their confirmation bias into a problem where that
Yeah.
could plausibly have like so many different answers.
The 2009 financial crisis in particular is really funny, just sort of the diversity in thought. I think there was, oh God, I'm trying to remember what it was, but I think there was some Twitch panel I once saw with people arguing over this. And it was literally like a break. There were like four different people arguing. It was so funny. There was like a libertarian guy talking about how, it was government intervention in the first place that allowed the risk for these to be pushed versus like, someone more progressive talking about the lack of government regulation. I super agree that people will really look for kind of shop around for a solution that confirms their worldview. When I think in reality, it's a confluence of a ton of different things, and it's really difficult to say, oh, if only we had been more like libertarian, if only we had been more progressive, and in this way or that way, we could have alleviated this, because there's so many factors contributing to this.
Yeah.
It's a record year for housing, and it shows no signs of abating.
In the early 2000s, the price of borrowing to finance a house was very low, very attractive.
These exotic loans have exploded in the last 3 years. Interest-only loans, adjustable rate loans, no down payment options.
People who were earning like $1,000 a month working as a gardener or working as a hairstylist saying they were making $10,000 a month because you could do these things called stated income loans, which came to be known as liar loans, where you could just say, here's what I make, and nobody would check. And so you could get away with murder.
Demand for these million-dollar-plus homes has outpaced supply.
You got speculators buying multiple houses. People are flipping.
Your neighbor who's not as smart as you are, but nevertheless went out and bought a couple of houses and flipped them, is now driving a better car than you are. And you say, yeah, that does make pretty good sense. I wish I'd started earlier.
As the housing market heated up, there were asset management firms around the world that all wanted a way to benefit.
Most things on Wall Street start with a concept that makes a lot of sense. The thing about Wall Street is they take everything to an extreme.
They take thousands of mortgages and staple them together. And they go to investors and they say, what do you want? You want safe? You want risky? We got all these mortgages.
There was an incentive to chop up these loans because along the way, there was a profit, a fee to take for each institution that somehow touched every piece of the loan.
Goldman Sachs, with quarterly profits up 93%.
Everyone was making a lot of money because of the housing market, liquidity, globalization.
Top executives will earn as much as $20 to $50 million each.
Just the booming 2000s, people were making so much money. I can make 10, 15, 20, 30, 100 to $200 million. And there was this competition, which was ridiculous.
Chuck Prince was the CEO of Citigroup, and he had an amazing line, which was, while the music's playing, you gotta dance.
Big bonuses are driven simply by profits and competition.
Everybody was looking at the success of Goldman Sachs and of Morgan Stanley and of Lehman Brothers, all of whom were making more and more profits.
The company will distribute a record high $16.5 billion in compensation.
So there was this remarkable pressure on everybody to keep dancing.
Another part of what drove this was belief that home prices would never go down.
The shaky housing market starting to crack at the foundation.
Particularly hard-hit markets, Miami, Vegas, Northern Virginia, right here in D.C.
Historically, house prices have been somewhat disconnected across different parts of the country, but this housing bubble did end up being national, and it did have implications for the whole economy.
The real estate bubble, everybody knows, has burst.
This is the hangover after the great frat party you went to.
House prices started to fall. The economy started to slow.
Those adjustable rate mortgages are now coming due.
People who had bought these adjustable rate mortgages, when they started to reset, they couldn't afford to make the higher payments. They tried to refinance them, but their house prices declined in value, so they couldn't refinance them.
Foreclosures are up over 1,000%.
Some people start defaulting on their mortgage payments. And now that begins to ripple through.
It was very, very bad. A lot of people lost their homes, a lot of people lost their savings.
Those falling home prices are like an infection, now spreading throughout the U.S. economy.
The system's not designed to function in an environment where house prices are going down. So these mortgage-backed securities start to unravel, and you got problems.
Investor confidence in the mortgage financing space is not doing well.
There is so little transparency and so little confidence in these securities that financial institutions were struggling.
I looked at one offering of mortgage-backed securities. I would have had to read over 300,000 pages to analyze that mortgage.
I had some of the smartest people in America couldn't explain to me what some of these instruments meant. And it's just like inventing more and more product in order to achieve higher and higher returns. It was taking bigger and bigger risks.
Unfortunately, maybe this is the weakness of the street back then.
How aggressive does he want to be? Maybe a lot.
I think discipline was kind of lacking. It was ourselves, Lehman, Goldman, Bear Stearns, others. The amount of risk we were taking was out of control.
Today, Bear Stearns stock dropped nearly 50%, a loss of $3 billion.
There's a rapid change in Bear Stearns over the past 48 hours. It reintroduces anxieties about what's not known.
The complete lack of confidence in Bear Stearns, a run on the bank. The Fed's job is to prevent a catastrophe.
This was a four-alarm fire. It became very clear to us that Bear Stearns wasn't going to exist on Monday if there wasn't a solution. The markets were so fragile and so interconnected that we were going to have to do some pretty repugnant things if we were going to save the American economy for the American people.
Hank came in and said, Bear Stearns is failing, and we got to do something about it. And my first reaction was, why? They made bad investments, Hank. And sadly, the people that invested in Bear Stearns, and sadly, those who worked for Bear Stearns are going to have to pay the price of working for an entity that made bad investments. He said, you don't understand. If they fail, it's going to affect the international financial system.
I had been told there was no authority for the Fed or anyone else to guarantee the liabilities of a failing non-bank. There is nothing more terrifying than feeling a great sense of responsibility and not having the authorities you need.
You know, we had each other in some sense to talk through options and strategy, and that helped a lot.
Ben, Tim, and I, we talked multiple times a day.
We always treated the three of them kind of as one entity, and the president always wanted to know when he was getting a recommendation from Hank, what did Ben and Tim feel?
I remember having a conference call where Hank and Tim and I talked about what the implications might be for the financial system if Bear Stearns failed and what we could do.
What we decided that morning was to buy some time to get through the weekend. Congress had given the Fed this emergency tool that you could use in extreme crisis to lend to an institution that was not a bank. So we had authority to lend, but the Fed had not done something like this since the Great Depression.
Ben Bernanke made a really bold decision to extend a loan for 28 days.
The Federal Reserve agreed basically to help finance about $30 billion of Bear's risky assets. This was the first important intervention that we did, and it was a tough call. I was a registered Republican. I believed in market solutions to economic problems, but I was a student of the Great Depression. When I went to graduate school, I knew I wanted to do economics, but I didn't know what area. And I said to myself, the Great Depression was one of the most important events of the 20th century. About a third of all the banks in the United States failed. And that, in turn, created a tremendous contraction in the amount of credit available to ordinary households and businesses. My grandfather's drugstores kept going out of business in the 1930s, and it created enormous hardships for many, many years. Later on, when I was a policymaker, took to heart the idea that allowing the financial system to collapse and the credit system to collapse was going to be extremely dangerous for the whole economy, and that was why it was so important to make the loan.
Bear Stearns was forced to take an emergency loan funded by all of us. The taxpayer bailout prompted investors to dump Bear Stearns stock.
As Bear Stearns was going down, President Bush was scheduled to be in Wall Street to make a speech at the New York Economic Club.
43rd President of the United States. Mr. President, the floor is yours.
He had showed the speech to me. He had a line in it that said there could be no bailouts. I started off by saying you could take that line out about no bailouts.
President Bush tried to make light of a grim situation.
Seems like I showed up in a interesting moment. I was unhappy about it, you know. I was a free marketer. I told people that, you know, and firmly believed it, and still do, by the way. But Hank is a persuasive guy, and I trusted him.
Then what became apparent was a loan that was permissible for the Fed to make. No way was it going to stop an investment bank from disintegrating. And fortunately, J.P. Morgan was a buyer.
It's a really risky thing buying a big investment bank. It was a house on fire. It was collapsing. Hank and Tim were, I want you to buy it. You want to buy it. You should buy it. I said, we'll do anything we can to help. I can't be irresponsible to J.P. Morgan. I can't end up being a teetering giant after this.
He wanted to own Bear Stearns. There's no doubt about it. I'd gone to bed on Saturday night thinking we had a deal.
At one point on Sunday, I called up Hank and said, Hank, we can't do it. It's a bridge too far. And then we started working on, well, what could you do to do it? Which is why we had this idea, well, if the Fed could finance this $30 billion, we can handle the rest of it.
Bear Stearns has a bag, let's say, of garbage. Let's just say it's trash. And nobody wants to buy all of Bear Stearns and the trash. Jamie Dimon says, I'll buy Bear Stearns, but you guys are gonna have to share the trash with me. You, Tim Geithner and Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson, you gotta take the trash out.
It would be like Fox bailing out NBC. JP Morgan Chase joins the Federal Reserve in a frantic attempt to rescue Bear Stearns.
That was very controversial because that was, in essence, the first proto-bailout.
People woke up on Monday and thought that it was the heist of the century. People thought Jamie had stolen Bear, and people thought that Hank had basically given away the store by taking on $30 billion of terrible crapola. And that was the beginning of this debate in the country about what was happening, how bad it was going to be, and whether we should be doing any of this.
One thing I think that's really interesting and really insightful about this documentary, and I think this is a great example of it, is just how much of this is like individual relations and a couple of like a handful of people trying to sort out the problem. You know, when Jamie Dimon is talking about how he was on the phone with Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke, and they were trying to figure out, you know, exactly what they could do, and they were trying to get him, you know, this one guy essentially, to make the call to trigger this huge economic deal to try and, you know, stop what at the time was, you know, this brewing economic crisis. I think is really insightful. People, I think, often make this mistake of viewing our institutions as like these monolithic entities, you know, where they'll talk about, you know, well, what would the CIA do? And, you know, you invoke this idea of like, you know, this shadowy, you know, men in black. But a lot of our big financial, or a lot of our big institutions, be they financial or otherwise, are made up of people who are subject to a lot of the same benefits and problems that we think of normal people as having. And I think it's a much less appealing or interesting worldview, but I think it's a very true one, that a lot of our institutions are driven by individual people that you know, have preferences and make mistakes, and, you know, aren't just these like monolithic entities that are, you know, robotically pursuing one directive.
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, I had a really similar thought. Earlier on in the movie, they were talking about the three guys like having breakfast with each other once a week, and I was thinking like isn't it a little bit crazy that the quirks of a couple of individual relationships like that can have such a big, you know, downstream effect on all the rest of us. But I think like that's kind of the whole concept of introducing an element of centralized planning into the economy, right? It's like the benefit you get from it is that if those relationships go well and if those people make effective plans, then it's the best case scenario. And if those relationships go badly, those people make ineffective plans, then it's just the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
Communication was a really tough issue during the crisis. None of us were able to convince the public that what we did was not for Wall Street, but it was for the American people.
And they still haven't.
Who worked hard to buy their homes. That's why we say, not Wall Street, but Main Street.
We should have done a better job of explaining the financial system was so concentrated and so intertwined that if you want to stop the bleeding, you've got to go to the source. And the source is Wall Street. And if you don't stop the bleeding at Wall Street, you kill the economy. This was an extraordinary period. There was this presidential election going on. We had these two candidates, both running against President Bush. because he was very unpopular.
We need to bring real change to Washington, and we have to fight for it.
That was a bad period for President Bush. Remember, we're still in the midst of the war in Iraq, and President Bush was generally unpopular in the public, partly as a result.
When you're president, you don't make decisions based upon your personal popularity. You don't have to be a PhD to know it's unpopular to spend taxpayers' money on Wall Street. Now, it may be okay in New York, but you get out to Midland, Texas, it's not okay.
You know, it was pretty clear what the public wanted to hear. It's very easy to tap into that populist strain and be against bailouts and putting government money in anything.
Mismanagement and greed became the operating standard while regulators were asleep at the switch.
This sounds like a Trent Reznor soundtrack. It makes me wonder.
Important, but at the end, markets win.
The housing market, in plain English, is coming apart.
As 2008 progressed, the crisis intensified. We were all concerned about Fannie and Freddie, but we didn't know how bad it was.
Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are the backbone of the U.S. mortgage market, holding roughly half of all U.S. mortgages. Fannie and Freddie may not have enough money on hand to stay in business.
The first thing you have to understand about Fannie and Freddie is that they are so important to the machinery of everyone's everyday life. Any person who has a mortgage, it's pretty likely that Fannie and Freddie touches you. They were publicly traded companies, like any company you would invest in, like Starbucks, like Apple, like Google. And yet they were known as government-sponsored enterprises because there was this idea that the U.S. government stood behind their debt, so that if they ever couldn't pay their debt, the U.S. government would step in.
They got a government money printing machine in which the government implicitly says, if everything goes wrong, we'll foot the bill.
That was a guarantee. It was written nowhere on paper. It didn't actually exist. And so it came to be known by this term called the implicit guarantee.
There was no guarantee, but the market assumed that there was. So you had management teams and shareholders making money off a government guarantee.
They insured something on the order of $5 trillion, something close to half of all the mortgages in the United States were insured and resold by Fannie and Freddie.
The fear was if Fannie and Freddie defaulted, that would throw the global financial system into chaos.
The company's stock price is off more than 85% since the credit crisis began last August.
They've announced huge losses. Their stock is diving. So I needed to ask Congress for enough money to calm the markets.
Thanks, Secretary Paulson and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. We thank Chairman Bernanke for his involvement.
This was a tough political ask with members of Congress. I felt we needed expansive authorities.
One of the proposals that you've suggested is an increase in the Treasury line of credit for Fannie and Freddie. And I have some concerns, and I suspect my colleagues do too, about having no cap, no limit at all.
If I asked for $100 billion, it wouldn't be enough. And I certainly knew I couldn't ask for a number that started with a T, trillion.
How much money are you contemplating here?
I would ask for it to be unspecified.
For some of us, it sounds a little bit like a blank check.
You're talking about potentially spending $1 trillion here.
We're a little skeptical.
One of the tough things about testimony was that you had multiple audiences. So you're sitting at this table with a glass of water, you're looking up at the senators, and so you're trying to answer their questions. But you know at the same time that you're talking to the TV camera, which is going out to American public, and then your staff member behind you gives you a piece of paper which says Dow Jones down 180 points. So you're also talking to the markets.
I looked at those hearings as largely theater. I was worrying about saving the financial system for the American people. These guys wanted to save the financial system, but they wanted to get elected. But I really believed what I said when I was testifying. I said, you know, if you give us unspecified authorities, it'll be so powerful that we won't have to use them. If you've got a squirt gun in your pocket, you may have to take it out. If you've got a bazooka and people know you've got it, you may not have to take it out. You're not likely to take it out. By having something that is unspecified, It will increase confidence, and by increasing confidence, it will greatly reduce the likelihood it will ever be
Do you
used.
understand the
You know,
point
he had
he's making there? Because it seems like that analogy is really hard for me to follow. Because like I get the point that if the stronger the weapon you have, the less likely you are to use it, and you know that makes sense to me. But like making that analogy to the financial market is something that I'm having trouble understanding.
It's specifically how much money that he would be authorized to use. So the idea is that the more powerful his weapon is the more money that he could theoretically have in order to stop the crisis. So the idea is, if you only have a squirt gun, maybe you only have $1 billion, and ultimately, in the scale of the crisis that's emerging, that's not that much. But unspecified, unlimited money, that's much more powerful in terms of your ability to look at any financial institution that's failing and try to finance or credit or buy out or bail out that institution. So as a result, if people think that there is a much greater likelihood of the Fed or the Treasury to stop the flow or to stop any of these things from going under, they're going to be less likely to almost financially bet on that, either by pulling their money out or anything else. So the idea is it's almost the reverse of a chilling effect, where it's almost like because of the implication that they have this tool, we're not all going to jump ship from this financial institution, because we know that this financial institution is much less likely to go down because they've got 100 billion, and it's even less likely they've got 200 billion, and it's even less likely if we know that they've got unlimited or unspecified.
Okay, so they're specifically trying to deter investments that are like shorts on the market. They're trying to deter people from betting against the stock market because it'll be like so secure having so much money behind it. That's the idea.
Sort of, and I think it's not just betting against it, but also people like selling off their stock, and essentially to the point everyone jumping ship from specific investment banks to the point where those investment banks go under, and then there's this huge like chain reaction in the financial markets is what they're trying to avoid.
Okay, yeah, that I could buy it. That was a very good explanation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tremendously valuable skill, which is how to convince people to do something they did not think was in their interest.
It was Hank, in that instance and in others, who kind of laid down the law and said, this is what's going to happen.
I'm about getting something done that can get done, that will make a difference, and in my judgment is in the best interest of the taxpayer.
The sense of urgency is something I think all of us, at least most of us here, appreciate.
Look, we're in the middle of this thing, and it's getting worse. And the Secretary of the Treasury says, I need some of these tools. We're in the eye of the hurricane at that point.
I got the bazooka, and I didn't think we were going to have to take it out, but the most aggressive investors get very quickly to where the most fearful investors are, faster than you can imagine. And so it was only a matter of time until we had to use the bazooka.
The takeover of Fannie and Freddie was like a military operation. Hank was the general.
Congress had no idea we were thinking of nationalizing them. And so we needed to keep this quiet.
Fannie and Freddie were politically powerful entities. I mean, really powerful. They made people rich. Most of them were very well connected.
We had to do it in a way that they didn't anticipate, otherwise they would have used political and other forces to prevent it.
I remember talking to President Bush about this, and he was asking, how can you possibly get this done without them knowing and fighting? And I remember it came out of my mouth, the first sounds they're going to hear is when their head hits the floor.
This is the full Paulson.
There were some bitter pills. The CEOs were replaced. They were going to lose their golden parachutes.
History was made when Washington took the reins at the two organizations that back or guarantee nearly half of America's home loans.
Today's action should accelerate stabilization of the housing market, ultimately benefiting financial institutions. Naively, I thought maybe we brought down the hammer. As I told President Bush, maybe this is what it's going to take to put out the fire.
We began with a more than 300-point bounce. Fanny Bang, we called it.
On Saturday night, I was sound asleep. It was an optimistic sleep. My phone rang. It was Barack Obama.
How are you, sir? What's your name? Nice to see you, bud. Thank you so much. I gotta have my John Deere hat.
On that call, he said, look, I know I'm going to be President of the United States.
Yeah, at that point, I was fairly confident I was going to win the election. And
I just love how Obama's like, yeah, I think I basically knew I was going to win there. I kind of had it in the bag.
I already felt as if I had some responsibilities for an economy that I was going to have to manage.
Wait, do you know like how far into the election that was, or how far away?
I think this is in September, late September.
Okay, so so this is like after the financial crisis was pretty well underway, and there wasn't much time left, and he was already way ahead. Okay,
Yeah.
it makes sense then. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is, man, just the cherry on top of all of this is the fact that there's this huge election going on at the same time.
Yeah.
Company from my home state. We make these tracks. All right. Appreciate you.
To Hank's credit, he was consistently straightforward and honest and transparent with us, and I ended up developing a good relationship with him and trusting him, and it had been impressed upon me that if this thing went sideways, we could have a depression, and whatever short-term political advantage I might gain from it was not something that I was going to be interested in playing.
Very nice to meet you. I'm proud of you. Appreciate you.
He very nicely warned me, you better take care of the Republican candidate, because if I start hearing populist anti-bailout rhetoric for him, I'm going to have to start talking that way.
2 years ago, there was one man who stood up.
I think that's a really interesting insight, I think, where Obama's talking about, I, am ultimately limited by, what is politically feasible. And at a certain point, if the people want to hear something, even if it's not true, there's a certain deference that any politician is going to have to give to that. There's this real sort of give and take with how much you can dictate to the people versus how much the people will dictate to you. I'm reminded of, I think, what a lot of more establishment Republicans have had to do in the Trump years. People who very obviously do not like Trump and were very against Trump when he ran. But at first, but now that he's in charge and now that he's very popular in the Republican Party, they are going to be lockstep. This is why there are clips of like Lindsey Graham, saying things like, if we run Trump, we'll lose and we'll deserve to lose. And now he's like, yes, sir, Mr. Trump, whatever you want.
Yeah, so democracy creates a lot of really strange incentives sometimes, and I think it's worth remembering that whenever we're talking about like what are the pros and cons of different systems of government, it's like this stuff runs a lot deeper than just a surface level understanding of like what are the mechanics of it. I mean, like the whole point of democracy is that if you believe in it, is that we think those kind of weird incentives might be better than the incentives created by a different system, but it's still worth bearing them in mind, right? Like if your job depends on communicating with the public in a certain way, then you're going to be incentivized to maintain that certain type of relationship with the public, and possibly at the expense of good policy or good or I don't even know what is the word, like possibly at the
Just good
expense of
governance.
spreading misinformation or whatever.
Yeah, and I it's especially interesting the way that I think Obama asks Paulson, make sure that the other guy isn't going too far in this, because I think it almost betrays like, I think what some people would describe as like, oh, this is like the swamp, this is the crooked establishment getting together and figuring out. But from my perspective, I think, this is exemplifying one of the strengths of our system, which is having like institutions and a culture of norms, that is like almost respected. This almost like a gentleman's agreement of like, hey guys, we're not going to go too crazy. And then the real danger of having a true outsider, someone like Trump, who really doesn't care about the institution, the fact that, we have these norms for good reasons, and is going to be willing to run all the way down the line when it comes to dangerous rhetoric.
Yeah, so the interpretation of this is the swamp and it's all corrupt versus the interpretation of we have a culture of norms that are here to stabilize the system in a certain way. I mean, those really don't even contradict each other though, right? It's just like kind of putting
Yeah.
a positive or a negative spin on the same set of facts.
Mm-hmm.
Up and warned us about the problems at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It was John McCain.
Next day, I talked with John McCain and Sarah Palin. I encouraged everybody to call me Hank. I did not want to be Mr. Secretary. But somehow or other, I don't know what it was on that first call, the way she immediately started saying Hank, the tone of voice, it rubbed me a little bit the wrong way.
People in Florida are and should be outraged. Huge financial institutions going under because of their own bad practices, and now asking the public to bail them out.
Despite what her other failings may or may not have been, she certainly understood where the public was with regard to bailouts.
Early September, there was so much bailout fatigue. There was so much opposition to not just what we'd done in Bear Stearns' case, but to the Fannie Freddie receivership. People had no sense for the perils of what was happening.
The economy is like a house of cards. The bottom could still drop out, sending markets into a free fall.
I had grown up in the Treasury in a series of crises that happened to other countries, beginning in really '94 with the Mexican financial crisis. I then lived through a whole wave of really devastating emerging market financial crises in Thailand, Korea, Brazil, Indonesia.
In Indonesia, fears of financial disaster hit the streets, with long lines formed outside supermarkets.
I could see, how deep the depressions were, how tragic were the costs, and how hard it was for people to figure out a way to navigate their way through it. Had a huge impact on me, of course. Panics are different from all other crises, and in a panic, you have to use overwhelming force because you have to convince people it's safe not to run, not to panic. And to do that, you have to muster a wall of money.
Lehman taking a beating right now, down about 35%. It hasn't traded this low since 1998.
Lehman Brothers, in particular, both was leveraged, but more importantly, had taken on a huge amount of real estate. And that real estate, every day, was being marked down even more.
Another tough day for shares of Lehman Brothers today. CEO Dick Fold is actively shopping the entire brokerage firm.
Dick Fold was looking for capital. He contacted us. I had talks with him. I came down on a Friday night, I remember, and looked through a 200 and some page 10K and scribbled a lot of notes on it. I still have the 10K. And by the time I got all through, I knew we weren't going to make a deal.
By that week in September, they were close to out of options.
The debate now is the role the government will play in all of this.
Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson and Fed Chief Ben Bernanke are behaving like socialists and should resign. That is what Kentucky Senator Jim Bunning says.
They both should be fired. First for Bernanke not watching the store, and Paulson because he didn't tell the banking committee the truth.
Hank in particular was taking a lot of the heat for, quote, being the bailout king and the like.
If it's $200 billion for this bailout, it was $300 billion for the housing bailout, it was $30 billion for Bear Stearns. I mean, where does it end?
Now there are rumors that Lehman might be in trouble. The government would obviously come to the rescue. Lehman.
I made frequent calls to Dick Fold. We had told him repeatedly that the government can't put in capital.
The source was close to Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson saying there will be, quote, no government money in the resolution of this situation.
He puts the word out to the street. We are not in the bailout business.
I did call Hank saying, you're going to regret that because it's not going to get solved without more public money. He said, I understand that.
This was a tactic, plain and simple. If we didn't communicate that, all the other Wall Street banks would believe that the Fed, would be there to put capital in.
We had two potential buyers for Lehman. The first was Bank of America. The second potential acquirer was a British bank called Barclays. We assumed that there would be some bad assets. The hope was to keep the Fed out of it if possible and to get the CEOs from the other Wall Street firms to get involved in buying those or holding those assets in some way.
Wall Street titans and top government officials have been huddled in emergency meetings, scrambling to prevent the collapse of the giant investment bank Lehman Brothers.
I convened the heads of the major firms in New York that evening.
The best financial brains in the world are in pressure negotiations to resolve the fate of Lehman Brothers.
This is like the five families. Every major character on Wall Street. This is Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. This is John Thain of Merrill Lynch, Vikram Pandit of Citigroup, Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs, John Mack of Morgan Stanley.
I thought it was exactly the right thing to do. They had a problem to solve, and their problem was my problem.
These CEOs were all scared, and they were scared about what Lehman going down might mean.
I said, you know, you're all exposed too. We don't have the means to protect you from this.
They're effectively being given an assignment. Hank and Tim are the school teachers telling the children, you're going to be broken up into groups to come up with a deal to ring fence these assets.
No one said, oh shit, I don't want to do this. But it was complicated. I mean, all of a sudden you're looking at all this data.
The banking crisis forcing another long weekend of work in both Washington and New York.
Top executives of rival banks met under tight security to discuss plans to buy Lehman whole or in parts.
It turns out that one of the potential buyers really had no interest in Lehman.
Bank of America is now reported to be in advanced talks to buy Merrill Lynch.
A shotgun wedding arranged in 2 days.
And the fact that Bank of America purchased Merrill Lynch took another serious problem off our hands.
But Barclays sure seemed very interested and identified the assets that need to be left behind. And I think the banks were largely on board to step up and take it.
We were all under the impression that this was going to go through.
There's one major hitch, which is the British government. Tim Geithner and Hank Paulson get a phone call.
There were several people they spoke to, including the bank supervisor, but the decision maker was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Secretary of the Treasury, essentially, of the UK, who was named Alistair Darling.
And the British said that for Barclays to buy Lehman would be like importing the US cancer.
Hank called and said, the British will not allow, the British bank to take over Lehman, and it's going to fail.
I was very angry. It was a very unpleasant surprise.
Hank told the staff, he said, the British grin-fucked us. And Hank walked into the other room and said to the CEOs, it's over.
Wall Street in crisis mode this morning. Lehman Brothers says it will file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy today.
The Journal and the Times editorial on Monday morning, I would say, expressed relief that the Fed hadn't intervened.
I'll tell you, none of the three of us looked at that as a positive event. We didn't know how bad it was going to be, but we knew it was bad. Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you all had an enjoyable weekend. Yeah. Monday afternoon, I was standing in the White House in front of the press corps, putting the best face I could on Lehman. As you know, we're working through a difficult period in our financial markets right now.
Lehman was a massive mistake. And I think maybe those who were involved in that decision will still defend it, but I think when you look at the tremors afterwards, I think that goes down as one of the most colossal mistakes ever.
There's a lot of retrospective analysis and so on. I think people need to appreciate that all these decisions had to be made in real time in very, very time-pressured situations. We could have lent money to Lehman, but it would not have been enough or sufficient to prevent the company from failing. There was a broad-based run going on throughout the entire company, not just on its short-term funding, but on its derivatives and on many other aspects of its business. And so the company was not savable.
For the people who believe that if they had just saved Lehman, then there would be no financial crisis, you're being naive. If it weren't Lehman, it would have been Morgan Stanley. It would have been somebody, because the fundamentals were so bad.
The Dow fell by 4.4% today, more than 500 points, the worst one-day point drop since 9/11.
After Lehman, I remember I called my management team and said, you're going to see the worst
week ever in the financial history of the United States.
It was a huge liquidity problem. The bank interlending market was drying up.
You know, any institution across the United States, Caterpillar, GM, Ford, Chrysler, Harley Davidson, anybody whose existence depended on the ability of your customers to borrow or your ability to borrow, at that point, I think people thought that, you know, it was dire. We were a few days away from the ATMs not working.
I could see the crisis spreading very, very quickly from Wall Street to Main Street.
That week, one of the largest McDonald's franchisees in the country calls Ken Wilson, who's working for Hank Paulson in the Treasury, and literally says to him, I don't think I'm going to be able to make payroll next week. Think about that. And you might say, so why couldn't McDonald's do this? Well, guess what? They rely on Bank of America to roll their paper, and they're worried the Bank of America is not going to do it.
The markets were affecting the real economy. The markets were closing down, people cutting back hiring, cutting back investing, cutting back spending to protect themselves, and you were looking at what looked like could be a Great Depression. I described it as an economic Pearl Harbor. The 1929 panic was nothing like this. The system had stopped.
A day after the failure of Lehman Brothers and the fire sale of
on why he doesn't think the 1929 crisis was like that.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to hear the differences. I think this is a really good sort of, I think, explanation of why this was such a big deal at the time. Because I think that there's still this mistaken belief by people that, you know, this was that the bailouts weren't necessary, or that just like fundamentally that whatever was going on in the financial institutions was, you know, their own business. Whereas, you know, you can really start to see the picture being painted of, you know, when you have this massive failure, you know, all these lines of credit and lending start to retract. And if all of that starts to retract at the same time, you know, in the span of about a week, it just has like disastrous effects on the economy.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that if the stability of the system was built on this assumption that the government would be willing to step in and stabilize things if necessary, that there was this backing behind the financial system, that then it had better exist when it needs to, or else
Yeah, exactly.
everybody's confidence in the entire thing is going to fall apart. And then when you have, and you know, the financial system is kind of built entirely on people's confidence and trust, so it can't really
Yeah,
survive
and it and
without
it
that.
and it very much becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. It reminds me of the description of like a deflationary spiral, where when people think that the currency is going to deflate, you know, that means that if they wait, their currency will become more valuable. So people all simultaneously start spending less. And then that means that there's less of currency in circulation, which means it deflates further, and then it just becomes this spiraling thing that, you know, can take like a decade or more to get out of because people are so afraid. And it's really kind of scary sometimes to think that, you know, if they had been, you know, 2 weeks slower on some of these solutions, that who knows how far, you know, the crisis of confidence could have spiraled out of control and just like exponentially gotten to more sectors of the economy before had they had acted. It really, I think, belies the need for like lightning quick responses on these kinds of things.
Yeah, so on some level, it's got to be acknowledged how dangerous it is to build a system that relies on lightning quick responses, though,
Yeah.
right? Like we built this very fragile Jenga tower of an economy where you know we've got to like rush to rescue it if one little thing goes
Hmm.
wrong. So I don't
Yeah, I
know.
think one of the biggest takeaways from the crisis, and particularly from the portrayal given by this documentary, which I mostly agree with, is the fact that it never should have gotten to this point. There are a number of times throughout this documentary coming up, and we've already seen one when I think it was Jamie Dimon got that approach about how they needed 23 billion before Asia opens, or they're going to have to declare bankruptcy. We should never be at that point where you're going to the decision maker and you're like, hey, we need to do this in the next 10 hours, or who knows what the fuck is going to happen. That these institutions, if you are going to be too big to fail, there's gotta be way bigger guardrails, if you want to take that position, because you just can't. If the American economy and the world economy relies on you not failing, then you just cannot play by the rules that everyone else plays by. You've got to have good greater tolerances or more oversight or something, whatever it is. If you're too big to fail, then you are not just any business anymore. And we
Yeah.
have got to we've got to regulate off of that basis with that knowledge in mind.
Yeah, and if we're not able to provide the kind of guardrails that you're talking about, then we can't really allow these institutions to get to the point where they're too big to fail.
Mhm.
It seems like we've kind of gotten away from I don't know, there was a big anti-monopoly movement in the very early 1900s, and so I wonder um like are we engineering too fragile of a system by allowing so much consolidation,
Mhm.
by allowing because there's probably lots of businesses now, not lots, but maybe 10 or so, where if they were to crash, it would just be like a disaster for the entire economy. Like imagine if Amazon just went bankrupt tomorrow. It would we'd be pretty screwed.
Yeah. And I think the really big problem with the financial crisis is that all of these institutions were reliant on one specific thing. It's hard to think of, what's one thing that could make Amazon and Walmart and McDonald's go bankrupt. It's like, I don't know, like whatever that would be, like, I don't know, like World War III or something, something crazy like that. That isn't even really, now you're just talking about everything. But all of these banks, if mortgage-backed securities go 3 percentage points up on delinquencies, then every major investment bank in America goes under. That's the kind of vulnerability that is just unacceptable if these institutions are this critical to the American economy.
Yeah, I wonder if there even needs to be one single thing that could make all of them go under, though, right? Because I wonder if it might be the case that those institutions are so interdependent on one another that if one of them were to fail for just reasons that are entirely internal or unique to itself,
Mhm.
that might still have such humongous ripple effects that it would fatally disrupt the
Mhm.
others. And so if I want to pick on Amazon as an example, right? I mean, we saw during the COVID pandemic how reliant we all were on Amazon, right? It's like if Amazon were to fail, I mean, sure they have competitors, but their competitors are just nowhere near able to
Mhm.
provide they couldn't really step up overnight. It would
Yeah,
take many
definitely not.
years for them to get to the point of what Amazon's doing now. Um, and so if Amazon were to fail, like so many other sectors of the economy are dependent on it, that even if Walmart or whatever the other ones you named are not directly invested in Amazon, like indirectly they must be, right?
Mhm.
Because they're invested in communities that are invested in Amazon.
Yeah. It's funny going back to the thing we said at the start, you can't run tests on these kinds of things. It's that's sort of the question that underlies this, because Amazon, what if it was only one investment bank, or what if it was, not investment bank, but just this huge sector of the economy? Because, on the way, we've got good reasons to think that maybe, investment banks are a lot more critical to the economy, that if an investment bank goes down, it's going to have a bigger ripple effect because of things like loaning and providing the ability, and then especially if all of them go down at the same time. But man, macroeconomics is really, really hard. And I think most, economists would admit that, we don't have this down to like 2 + 2 = 4. And if the Challenger rocket can, blow up in the middle of the sky, there is a certain degree of uncertainty we have in regards to the economic solutions, and that's a hell of a thing to be gambling on, where you're like, well, we don't think that this will cause, economic Armageddon, but we actually are not certain of that to the degree that we would like to be. We're a lot less certain about this than you are about like your airbag going off.
Yeah, so the difficulty of understanding that, I think, is actually one of the strongest arguments for libertarianism, by the way, because you can't really give informed consent to participate in a system where you don't understand what the hell is going on, and then if nobody really understands the whole thing of what's going on, it's like nobody can really like give informed consent to participate in an economy like this, where we just don't understand the consequences
Yeah,
of our
I think
actions.
that there's an argument that's sometimes made by more left-leaning people that like these financial incentives, or that these financial systems aren't complex, that it's just, people say it's complex as a way to like make themselves seem more important, and I think that's total bullshit. I think these financial systems are just ludicrously complex. And on the one hand, they are amazing engines for economic growth, but on the other hand, I think you sometimes can see the failures that this financial crisis is one, where there's legitimately like a part of this that's like the machine has run away from the inventors and they're not even exactly sure how it works, and they're only starting to realize, oh, this is not going to function well in an environment like they said earlier. This is just not going to function in an economy where house prices are going down, and we're realizing this because it's starting to blow up on our faces because house prices are going down, and it's way too late for us to do something about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And when people can make very high risk gamble, like if they have a high confidence belief that the housing market will never go down, and then they're also able to make these very like high risk gambles on that belief, then yeah, it's a I mean, I guess that's how all this happened.
Yep.
Lynch, attention turned to AIG.
The world's largest insurance company, American International Group, is seeking emergency funding as it struggles to stay afloat.
AIG effectively was insuring all the other Wall Street banks.
Wait a minute. All your insurance is from an insurance company that's about to go bankrupt. Now you see how the fire spreads from one company to the next company. And then everybody looks and says, ooh.
AIG must raise at least $40 billion and fast.
AIG, the situation kept worsening. When we got told that they weren't going to make it through the day, the needed balloon, so it was $85 billion. Imagine that.
Fed can lend against collateral. And we essentially decided that even though the loan to AIG would be very large, that there was enough value in all these insurance companies that we could take it as collateral.
AIG may not have been too big to fail, but it was certainly too interconnected to the economy to fail.
By Tuesday night, the AIG saga is at least temporarily over. They stuffed the turkey with $85 billion and they fired the CEO.
Volatility does continue in a big way today. I think it may be that the whole AIG bailout is not enough for the market in its entirety.
Now we're talking about Morgan Stanley going under. If Morgan goes under, Goldman goes under.
The two remaining independent investment banks, Goldman and Morgan
You notice
Stanley,
that
are
guy's
acutely
eye
vulnerable.
looks really weird. The guy that was on
Sorry,
screen
who's
maybe
that?
like 5 seconds ago. His
The
left eye is super weird. This guy, look, his left eye.
Oh yeah, huh. I wonder if that's like some sort of. I mean, I assume the eye doesn't actually look like. I mean, maybe he has some condition. I'm being horribly bigoted right now. I assume it's just some sort of compression artifact.
I don't know
If
though.
Morgan
The thing
goes
is,
under,
I noticed it, way earlier in the documentary, and I thought like, oh, it must just be a reflection. Like there must be like a dark object off screen that's just getting reflected off his eye. But then
Oh
if
yeah,
you
it might be the
watch,
camera.
yeah, like it. Oh, yeah, I suppose maybe. But I mean, I've gotten the impression now just since I noticed it. That I think his eye is actually just weird. Like I don't know. Like he has some misshapen pupil or something. I mean, maybe it's a reflection of the camera.
Nope, no. I just looked up some other pictures of him, and yep, we are being horribly bigoted. He has It looks like he has some sort of condition for his left pupil.
What's
That
this guy's
caused
name?
Andrew Ross Sorkin.
I want to see a picture of this so up close.
Yeah, Sorkin has co coloboma in his left eye that sometimes make it appear as if he has two different colored eyes. The coloboma is a hole in one of the structures of the eye, such as the iris, retina, choroid, or optic disc. The hole is present from birth and can be caused when a gap called the choroid fissure, which is present during the early stages of prenatal development, fails to close up completely before a child is born. And yeah, the picture of this condition on the Wikipedia page is exactly what it looks like. He has.
Wow, I've never heard of that before.
Huh.
That's so interesting. I don't know, like, I feel a little bit bad about, like, treating this guy like he's a circus freak or something, like, "Oh my gosh, look at his weird eye," but, like, um, yeah, I don't know. T Totally irrelevant tangent to the rest of the this, but it just caught my attention.
Goldman goes under. The two remaining independent investment banks, Goldman and Morgan Stanley, are acutely vulnerable.
We worked quite aggressively with financial institutions. I was on the phone jawboning, urging them to raise equity.
Hank and Tim, and mainly Hank, was pushing at least Morgan Stanley to figure out a way to get external financing. Tim said, pick up the phone and call Jamie. He'll buy your bank. I said, Tim, yeah, he'll buy it for $2 a share. He said, I don't care what he pays for you. I want you to do it. And I said in one of my more stupid moments, well, I won't do it. I'll take the firm down first. And I hung up on him. Who the fuck does that?
And another example of just individual personality quirks
On
having
Thursday,
huge rippling
Hank
effects.
came in with Bernanke, with Geithner, and started talking to the president about we're going to need some legislative authority. We're kind of out of ammunition.
We needed to put capital into the banking system. But Hank's concern about capital injections was that it would look like the government was nationalizing or taking over the banking system. And so his idea was to buy troubled assets. This is why it was called the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TARP.
About halfway through the conversation, the president interrupted Hank and directed a question at Ben.
I asked her, we headed for a Great Depression, and Bernanke said, you know, it looks that way. And you have to make up your mind, you know. Do you care? And what I cared about was people that would be hurting. They were already starting to hurt. People were getting run out of their homes, payrolls couldn't be met. And I just could envision what a Great Depression would mean. If it's bad now, imagine how bad it would really get.
As we left that meeting, the president turned to us and said, if this is Hoover or Roosevelt, for damn sure I'm going to be Roosevelt.
What a line.
It's interesting that he would even say that, though, right? Considering the vitriol that a lot of right wing or people who believe in like free market economies often have toward Roosevelt, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, when the rubber hits the road, um, I think actually the way that President Bush put it is very accurate. You know, at the end of the day, you have to decide, you know, do you care that people are going to be out there suffering really badly as a result of these policies? And, you know, you have to make up your mind what's more important to you, you know, helping people or, you know, your allegiance to, you know, free market ideology when it seems like there's a conflict for those. And I think it's in those moments that you can really see sometimes the character or just sort of the underlying humanity a lot of the times where, you know, almost no president, you know, is going to want to sit there and be like, yeah, I don't really care about these people. You know, most people, you know, are still going to have a great deal of care and concern.
Yeah. The idea also that it would take a crisis to get people to reflect on whether they care more about that kind of thing, or if they care about like their ideology versus caring about the consequences that it has on people's lives. I would hope that people would have thought about that ahead of time, but apparently
Yeah,
not.
I think it's the case that, when you're talking about, smaller impacts, it's one thing, to preserve the system as a whole, and say, listen, I don't want people starving out in the streets, but we do live in on a market system, and, some market failures are going to mean that some people are going to have, face economic hardship. But it's another thing when it's like, man, the entire country's about to face economic hardship, preserving this system is at this point, and particularly preserving this strict adherence maybe doesn't make so much sense anymore. If it's if I'm talking about, upending a lot of our market to, save one company, it's like, I'm sorry, I don't think I can do that. But when we're talking about saving the entire country, it's like, okay, wait a minute.
Yeah. I mean, I would have hoped that when people are thinking about what economic ideology they should have in the first place, that those kind of scenarios would be baked into it, right? That like perhaps you wouldn't think of yourself as a hardcore free market guy as much, if you were aware ahead of time that you'd be willing to bend the rules and under severe enough
Mhm.
circumstances.
Yeah, that's definitely a fair criticism. I think it's just the case that, you know, it's one thing to talk the talk. It's another thing to be there in the moment when you've really got to make the decision. I'm reminded of there's this really good observation. I don't know whom, I'm sure many people made. I'm not sure who I heard it from, but there's a big difference sometimes in people in Congress who will talk about being like against the status quo. It's one thing, to be someone like AOC or something where you're voting against a policy that is going to be passed, right? For you to be like, Democrats should push harder than what we got. I'm going to vote against it. When you know that Democrats have a supermajority in the House, it's going to get through. It's another thing to be John McCain and be the deciding vote on repealing Obamacare and to still say, no, I'm not going to support this. There's a big, big difference there.
Yeah. Another thing that came to mind was, there's this thing that you occasionally hear leftists say, where they'll say like, uh, I can't remember how the quote goes exactly, but it's something along the lines of like, "Cut a liberal and a fascist bleeds," or something
Oh,
like,
yeah.
right? But here's George W. Bush being the reverse version of that, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I think yeah, he's George Bush, man, is such a disaster, man. I think the George Bush presidency, it's funny. It reminds me a lot of the Tony Blair prime ministership. I mean, obviously they were both heavily involved in this, but man, if it wasn't for the Afghanistan and the Iraq War, I really want to say all these positive things about George Bush, because I do think in certain respects he's unfairly maligned, but you just cannot get over the colossal failures of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Not just in terms of like the policy failure, but the consequences of the failure from like from like like they talked about at the beginning of this, the sort of the rise in populism. Man, one sometimes I really wonder, if we had really made George Bush and Tony Blair and others face consequences, would we still be dealing with the same, level of populism if we had, thrown them to the ICJ, or if there had been some sort of, like really harsh consequences, if
Hmm.
the bell had tolled for them in a really serious way.
So,
You
so
gotta wonder.
to what degree do you think the populists have a real point, though, right? Like that the status quo kind of failed to reckon with its own problems.
I think that the populace will make really good like descriptive observations, but when they get into the why and then what the why as to why exactly these descriptions are true, and also when they get into their solutions, that's where they totally get lost. You know, Populists, like everyone, are going to say, "Man, the financial crisis, that was bad. The Afghanistan war, that was really bad." But when we get into the why, which is also then really crucial for the what should we do, that's I think where they just totally get lost and can really go down some dangerous roads. I think like the Occupy Wall Street movement is actually, you really start to see the bones, that and the Tea Party, of a lot of the more populist sentiment that you see, whether it's, in the Bernie camp or the Trump camp. And I think both of these camps are really wrong. And I think it's somewhat telling that you sometimes see them making these same mistakes. And I think it belies a certain kind of narrative that we live in where, I think that most people, particularly younger people, just sort of there's this assumption that like the government lies to you and everything, and the elites. I feel like it's almost like a given that most people believe something along the lines of that the game is rigged in some variety or another, and this is a really toxic and really dangerous idea that permeates our politics on all levels, and is why you see a lot of skepticism about all sorts of things, whether it's reform of the police or vaccination programs or stuff like this. And it really is dangerous because, I mean, number one, it's not true, which should be enough, right? It should be enough to say this isn't true, so we shouldn't believe it. But then also it gets really dangerous when people don't believe anymore. They don't have a buy-in into their institutions. These institutions are really, really important. And I think it also leaves people very vulnerable to be swindled. I think like the GME stuff is a great example where people have this vague understanding of like the financial institutions can't be trusted, and then they just basically get taken advantage of by sharks, in my opinion, when it comes to like this GME like stock short squeeze that is still going. We're almost like I think 2+ years out now, and there are people that are still talking about how any day now, the price is going to go to the moon. Crypto, I think, is another example.
So with the thing with people getting taken advantage of by sharks, do you think that Trump is kind of an equivalent of that?
Oh yeah, I think that Trump plays on people's fears in this way. And it's really, really dangerous, not only because those people are getting taken advantage of, but because normally that's our impetus for change. When there's a crisis, when something really bad happens, people understandably and correctly get really motivated. They'll get really angry, they'll get really sad, stuff like that. And that's how we manifest change, right? Is because things only change when people really work for them to change. And because you want to make sure you aren't changing for no reason, you want to have a threshold. So you have that threshold be, people really being like, holy shit, this is a really big problem. But then instead of that energy going into creating that change, it just goes into like a black hole where it does nothing. And then the problem gets worse. And that's how you sometimes, I think, have these like cyclic problems where I think like police reform is an example of a phenomena like this for on the left, where people there's this feeling people on the left where it's like, well, we're just never gonna fix this. There's this feeling of hopelessness where it's like because every year there's still more stories of the police, of the obviously horrific stories of police killings. Even though sometimes we are making real improvements incrementally, it's just that if we improve by 10%, that's huge, but that still means there's going to be really, tragic stories that we still need to do more on. And I think people just, get to this point where they throw up their hands and it's like, enough is enough. I want change. And then people are going to start to be willing to embrace more radical solutions. I think that's where like the defund the police stuff comes from. If we could have, I think, a faster degree of change or reform on police reform, then we wouldn't have had as much of like the crazy rhetoric around like all cops are bastards or we need to defund the police. And it's because we are failing to adequately solve these problems in a timely manner that I think these more extreme ideas start to carry more water.
Um, so have you ever heard of the concept of like maximizers versus satisficers? Do you know what I'm talking about? If it
No, I don't think I've heard of that.
Okay, so this is a thing in artificial intelligence, and it's also a thing in psychology. So the idea is that that if you have some kind of like value function that you're trying to maximize, in terms of just like, what is it that you care about in life, or what is it that you care about as an AI entity, right? Um, you'll have some function where like if you're a maximizer, it means that you're just constantly striving to do the best that you can do with respect to that value. And if you're a satisficer, then what you're trying to do instead is just prevent the worst case scenarios and just make sure you're doing good enough. And I think for the most part, people with respect to like almost all their political values seem to behave way more like satisficers rather than maximizers, right? Because there's so many issues that people only care about when there's an imminent crisis, and then they just don't give a shit other than that, right? And I don't know. It's like problems like this that can kind of like creep up on you stealthily, or like climate change would be another one. Are just really difficult to address in a public manner in a democracy. Well, I guess it's probably even true even if we were not in a democracy. Just because people just don't care enough to prioritize it until it's a crisis.
Yeah, I think it really speaks to, the need to sometimes have a disconnect between like a direct democracy. It's a very good thing that we don't publicly vote on like Supreme Court justices, I think, or like who the chair of the Fed should be and stuff like this. Because if that was the case, then you would really be lacking checks on things that the public does not know or just doesn't look out for. And I think that it's ironic because I think that much of the story of the 2008 financial crisis is the fact that they the watchmen on the wall were not doing a good enough job of making sure that these problems don't crop up in the first place. And a lot of, I think, what you see in this documentary, especially the back half that we're getting into here, is why it is so important to make sure that it doesn't get to the point where you need the public approval, because that is where you run into the problems of like this populist rhetoric, where it's absolutely the case that I think economically the case is just 100% true that you need to do some of these bailout type programs, whether we quibble over which ones are bailouts or not, but they're just super politically unpopular. So it's really important that we don't get to the point where we need the public to approve the thing that's publicly unpopular, or at the very least the representatives of the public, because then that can be really scary. It's like it can be like the dog that catches the car, and it's like we are all the dog, and we are now going to get run over because we have put ourselves in this situation that we should never have in the first place.
Yeah, for sure.
Usually, the Secretary of Treasury keeps me posted on the markets, but I haven't heard from him in a couple of weeks. In that amount of time, we've had Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, and then AIG. So I called him, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, to say, can you be here 9 o'clock the next morning? To which he said, Madam Speaker, tomorrow morning will be too late. So we planned a meeting for 5 o'clock that day.
Hank Paulson and Chairman Bernanke came in. And Chairman Bernanke said to the group, if you don't give Hank Paulson what he needs, within 72 hours, the entire banking system in the United States will fail, and then the world banking system will fail on top of it. One of the most sobering periods I've ever experienced.
You got to be kidding. I mean, why are we first meeting now? We've got 72 hours.
If anything, I think I might have understated in my predictions how bad things were actually going to get.
The Secretary described what they wanted to do. So we've tested many models, and we have what we call our break the glass plan.
Oh, we were going to buy troubled assets. Not sure how, but we were going to buy troubled assets.
About every 15 minutes, Majority Leader Reid would say, how much is this going to cost? $100 billion? No, 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 no. Hank said, no, 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 no.
We knew it couldn't start with a T. I couldn't ask for $1 trillion. I wasn't going to be unable to get unspecified again. And so the biggest number we thought we could get was $700 billion. And we thought, $500 billion sounds big, but $700 billion, $500 billion, $700 billion, many people don't know the difference. Basically, we wanted it to be as big as we could get without spooking Congress so it blew up in our face. I said we need the authorities immediately, and Harry Reid says Congress doesn't do anything immediately. And so it was after that where we all walked out and late at night had a presser.
We reached a bipartisan agreement to work together to try to solve this problem and to do it in an expeditious manner.
I am very impressed with Chairman Bernanke, Secretary Paulson. I've said that on a number of occasions. We look forward to working with them, and we're anxious to see their proposal, which we hope to receive in a matter of hours, not days.
We're coming together to work for an expeditious solution, which is aimed right. And of course, that was the best thing that happened for the next week, because after that, it was one difficult process.
Today, on behalf of Main Street, Congress had a chance to ask some hard questions about the $700 billion bailout of Wall Street.
Why are we asked to put $700 billion to keep CEOs in their office while families get kicked out of their homes?
Why do we have 1 week to determine $700 billion that has to be appropriated, or this country's financial systems go down the pipes?
I share the outrage that people have. It's embarrassing to look at this, and I think it's embarrassing for the United States of America. Their view is, right, same as all of our view is, if you take risk and you make money, that's fine, great for you. But if you lose money, we don't expect the United States of America to be there to save you. Anything that looks like a bailout is unpopular.
Too many people on Wall Street have been recklessly wagering instead of making the sound investments we expected of them.
The other crazy thing about this whole thing is happening in the middle of a presidential election.
If you give me your vote on November 4th, then together we won't just win Florida, we will win the general election, and you and I together, we're going to change the country, and we're going to change the world. God bless you. God bless America. Thank you.
Not only have I assured Paulson that we are not going to play politics with this, I actually reach out to McCain
That's a funny statement, considering what
suggest
you
to
said earlier.
him that we should make a statement expressing confidence that we can get through this difficult period, that now is not the time for politics. He asks me on the phone, what would you think about potentially suspending the campaign? And I say, well, I'm not sure that it's a good idea for you and me to be in Washington. That's just going to politicize the situation. Maybe half an hour passes, maybe less, before David Plouffe, my campaign manager, gets a call saying, listen, John's going to be going out in 2 minutes to announce that he's suspending the campaign. I said, no, that can't be right. I just talked to McCain half an hour ago. Well, sure enough.
This afternoon, John McCain dropped a political bombshell.
Tomorrow morning, I'll suspend my campaign and return to Washington. I'm directing my campaign to work with the Obama campaign to delay Friday night's debate.
So there was some cursing that took place in the room. That was irritating, to say the least.
McCain had called Bush and said he was going to interrupt his campaign and wanted to come back and help solve the problem.
And the president said, that is just the stupidest thing I ever heard.
There was a flurry of dramatic developments today as economic policy and power politics collided.
So I'm sitting there saying, oh my gosh, if he comes out against what we're doing, we'll lose the Republicans, we may lose the Democrats, and there goes our economy, there goes our financial system. Here comes another Great Depression.
It appears to me that John McCain is trying to divert attention to his failing campaign.
It reminded me of Andy Kaufman as Mighty Mouse. Oh, here's McCain. Here he comes to save the day.
That thing about the failing
Frank, the
campaign,
chief
that's
Democratic
such a dumb
negotiator,
thing
said it
to
was
say,
the
that
longest
Harry
tail.
said.
So what was that?
Harry Reid goes like, John McCain's trying to divert attention to his failing campaign. Like that's like almost verbatim something that Donald Trump would say.
Yeah.
Mary pass in the history of football and Marys.
I'm calling on the president to convene a leadership meeting from both houses of Congress, including Senator Obama and myself.
dead set against the meeting. He doesn't want the meeting. But, you know, if I'd have said no, it would have really hurt his campaign. I called Senator Obama at the time and said, I'm having a meeting at the White House, and I'd like for you to come.
President Bush was almost apologetic. He's saying, look, I don't know how well this is going to work. We'll try to make it as serious and constructive as possible. And I say, well, I appreciate that, Mr. President. I'll be there.
Keep moving, please. Keep moving.
It was high-stakes drama.
It was the most bizarre meeting. You know, sometimes history is stranger than fiction.
Okay, let's go.
I want to thank the leaders of the House and the Senate for coming. I appreciate our presidential candidates for being here as well. We are in a serious economic crisis in the country, and we know we've got to get something done as quickly as possible.
President Bush, ever gracious, defers to me as Speaker, and I say, thank you, Mr. President. Leader Reid and I have decided that we're going to yield our time to Senator Barack Obama.
He was very wise about it. He said, listen, I've been in touch with Hank Paulson, and I'm watching this crisis very closely.
I had, at that point, been pretty steeped in these issues and was pretty familiar with them. And I make my pitch, Mr. President, we want to act responsibly. We think it's important that taxpayer money isn't wasted.
He had a well-crafted presentation that the president then called on McCain, and McCain said, I'll wait my turn. And there's sort of a deflation around the room.
John didn't have much to say. The problem was, I think John still hadn't really thought through what exactly his approach would be at that point.
I knew that that campaign was staggering. I knew he couldn't possibly have developed another plan.
McCain doesn't want to talk. And I said, well, I think the Republicans have a perfect right to offer that plan. Somebody said, no one doubts that, but what do you think about it?
And it was so, shall we say, just not there.
I didn't believe he had a plan. They thought it was a really cool campaign gambit. They were playing checkers, not chess. They had only thought one move ahead.
It was a situation where I felt that he hadn't been served well. His team needed to make sure that he had an agenda that he was bringing to bear. And he didn't, and the meeting sort of descended into a little bit of chaos.
Barney Frank started shouting at him, "Where's your plan? Where's your plan, McCain?"
McCain would not say what he thought about the plan.
The meeting broke down into a shouting match. It was chaos and disarray.
Hallowed halls of government.
This thing turned into a food fight. Barney Frank yelling at some Republican guy, and it got out of control, and I basically said, the meeting's over.
It brought the meeting to an end. It brought the meeting to an end.
It was the most horrifying and dispiriting meeting in the White House that I ever experienced.
I asked him not to use the White House as a political backdrop. I said, because we're going to spook the markets. You walk out of here and you start giving people what happened in the meeting and this, that, and the other. The markets are shaky as it is, and we don't want to be a part of making them shakier.
I think you're waiting on bigger game than me.
Richard Shelby went running out and told the press that our plan was a disaster and there was no support for it.
We hadn't gotten an agreement. There's still a lot of different opinions. Mine is it's flawed from the beginning.
And the Democrats all went running into the Roosevelt room.
We're talking about what Obama is going to say in the press conference afterwards.
I was a little naive because I thought, geez, these are all my friends. I've been working with them. I've been talking with them regularly. And I was concerned that they were going to run out and what they were going to say to the press. So I came barging right in like I shouldn't have. And they're all huddled around Barack Obama. And I went right up to them like I was one of them. And they looked at me and they said, get out of here.
This is the famous meeting at which Hank Paulson, only half in jest, gets down on one knee and begs Nancy Pelosi not to torpedo the TARP legislation.
Hank knelt down and said, Madam Speaker, please bring the bill to the floor. And I said, well, you know, it's not us. We want a solution. You have to get the votes on your side.
The financial crisis was a life-altering experience for me. I would wake up in the middle of the night and I'd look into the abyss and I would see food lines and I would see millions and millions of people unemployed. It gave me really a new appreciation for fear that comes from trauma and, you know, the impact on people's lives when they go through prolonged periods of stress.
This was a really tough period personally and went on not just a few days, but really for months. For Lehman weekend, I basically was in the office the entire weekend, slept on the couch.
Can we pause for a minute?
Tim said,
So I just had this thought, you know, like about what I was saying earlier, where people will care way more about a problem if it's really like an imminent crisis, and they, you know, just don't give a shit until then. And it makes me wonder, like with the 2008 crisis, like as bad as it was, perhaps they averted, so you know, they might have succeeded to some degree at averting an even worse crisis. And I wonder if their success worked against them in the public relations way, right? Like if the crisis had actually gotten worse, then perhaps the public would have been more sympathetic to the efforts taken to combat it.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
but because the efforts taken to combat it, you know, took place when people were less worried about the crisis itself and more worried about like the possible corruption that it entailed or something like that. You get what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
No, 100%. I think that is absolutely correct. I think they did avert a much greater crisis, and in a way, it is to their detriment because people don't take them as seriously anymore. I think it was a very similar thing that sort of happened with COVID, where there were all these protestations about, man, it could be really, really bad. We need to do things, and then we do those things, and then more rightly, people are like, oh, look, it wasn't even that bad. What are you guys talking about? Um,
Yeah.
And it's like, you motherfucker, it's not bad because we did this shit and you were getting in the way. Like, yeah, I think that this is a phenomenon that happens a lot. I'm also reminded of a congressional hearing in the immediate aftermath of the Russia invasion of Ukraine, where one of the highest-ranking generals in the American military was being sort of grilled by Congress, and I think it was Matt Gaetz said, you said that if Russia invaded, Ukraine would fall, blah, blah, blah. And the general, interrupted and said, has it occurred to you that the reason Ukraine didn't fall is because of the things we are doing and have actively done? Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. That's absolutely what happened. And I think it's a problem that happens a lot.
So it seems like this is a problem with like preemptive solutions and like harm reduction strategies in general, right? That people are just way less sympathetic to the actions taken to prevent a crisis than they are to like they'd be more sympathetic to you, no matter what the crisis is. And I think COVID was a great example that you brought up. But I think just this is probably something that even just applies to people's everyday lives, right?
Yep.
Like if
It's a problem with counterfactuals. You never recognize the harm that didn't happen as much as you do as the harm that did, even if the harm that didn't happen would have been 10 times worse.
Yeah, I'm just imagining like, some couple going to marriage counseling or something, and then they like, rescue their relationship that would have been divorced or something like that, and then they end up resenting each other for the stuff that happened in the marriage counsel. I don't know. Maybe this isn't a good analogy, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I understand exactly. Yeah, it's just people really do not evaluate impacts or percentage chances in the right way. Um, Everyone should play poker competitively. We should have mandated competitive poker classes at schools, because if you ever talk to a poker player, it is so refreshing to hear them be like, oh, well, just because it happened this way doesn't mean, of course, that it was actually the right play or something. If you ask a poker player, you won the hand, does that mean you automatically did everything correctly? They'll, of course, be like, no. And a lot of people, it seems like, I mean, I think that people would answer, oh, well, no, of course not, but then they still act in that way. But yeah, it's just, I mean, everyone's stupid about something.
Um, okay, so you and I haven't actually talked about poker before, but I find it interesting that you bring it up because I used to competitively play poker, and
Oh,
the fact
really?
that you bring it up makes me think that maybe you did too.
No, no, I didn't. I just I've heard this analogy brought. I either got this from Destiny or I might have actually gotten it from Thorin, who's this very controversial figure in the esports scene. But basically just the idea that like poker players are really good at sort of evaluating the percentage, like getting it very much down to a science of how to actually play in a way where you're analyzing your actions in a holistic way. Because in poker, you have to play so many hands and stuff that that you have a huge sample size. It's kind of like baseball in that respect, where you can really utilize data science in a lot more. It's a lot less prone to randomness, and to play well, you almost have to optimize statistically, right? Or else you're going to be vulnerable to like donkey punches and stuff like that. Is the way that I've always heard it described to me.
Yeah, one thing that poker is really good about is helping you to correct for hindsight bias, right?
Mhm.
Because you can just play perfectly and still lose, or you can like play terribly and still win, and just having that experience happen to you over and over and over again, which it will if you play poker competitively, really helps you get a better intuition for the fact that you can't necessarily judge whether a decision was good just because of how it turned out.
Yep. It really forces you to confront that sometimes statistical realities of that otherwise sometimes I think with other things you can sort of get away with like deluding yourself.
So I want to say like I think you and I might have had a conversation before, like where you might have mentioned that you played Magic the Gathering. Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Do you think there's any parallel there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's some degree, maybe more back in the days when Auntie was a mechanic. I can imagine that would be pretty funny. But I think I there's probably some degree of parallels. I think that with poker, where in every hand or in every match, you're potentially losing some amount of real money. It really hits home in a way that in other things it doesn't. Um, but there's definitely some degree. I have a pretty casual experience with Magic, playing just like Commander and stuff. So I'm probably not the best like I don't have the most personal experience to draw on, but I definitely think there's some degree of parallel in any sort of game where you're playing a bunch of sort of probabilistic things that are very much reliant on decisions and not like skill in terms of raw mechanics. In games like in any FPS like Counter Strike or MOBAs like League, there's always like a thing oh maybe if I just misplayed a little bit, if I had played a little bit better here, if I'd aimed a little bit better. But in card games, it's very much like no, this is about the decisions made, right? There's not really much else going on here. I think actually maybe another thing I'd be curious to hear the perspective of like a professional chess player. What their perspective on something like this would be, where in chess, if you're, because even more so in chess, I mean, there is no randomness whatsoever. It is all just in
Oh,
the
I
like
disagree with that.
execution. Oh,
This is the
really?
thing that I've had like a bunch of disagreements about with chess players. I don't think it's true that there's no randomness in chess.
Huh. Well, I guess there's still random sorry, I shouldn't try to imagine what your position is. I should just ask you where do you think that randomness is coming from?
Okay, so I think the reason people say that is because chess does not have game mechanics where they purposely build in more randomness into it, right? So,
Mhm.
well, with one exception, which is that going first, like the whole like, do
Yeah.
you get to be black or white is normally randomly determined. So there's that, right? But here's the thing: is like people will say that chess is a game with no hidden information, and therefore that they um like you're supposed to be able to evaluate all the information at your disposal. But the thing is, like you actually just can't, right? Like you can't know all the possible moves, you can't know all the possible outcomes, you can't know what strategy your opponent is going to employ, and you can't have prepared against all the different strategies that might come up. And therefore there are functionally hidden pieces of information, even if they are not like purposely hidden by the rules of the game.
There's still like ceilings that like are randomly imposed. It's just that they're done so not by like the game's mechanics, but like the circumstance of like your own preparation or the game.
Right, exactly. And because the game takes place in the real world between two real humans with brains that are subject to those very limitations, the
Mhm.
randomness of the context bleeds into the game.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's really interesting. I never thought about it in that way, but I mean, that's definitely correct. I mean, like fundamentally, there's no question there. Um, that's really interesting. I never thought about that at all. That's something I'll have to reflect on.
I think that's true of almost all games of sufficient complexity. Like if you really wanted a game that has like close to no randomness, it would be like, tic-tac-toe or something like that.
Yeah.
But I mean, of course,
Where
even
where
there
where,
you have
where
to
there are
just
just strategies to like never lose
yeah, and even then you could
that are
say
very
that
easy to
there are,
execute on. But
maybe lightning hits you during the game or so, you know what I mean? You have to go to like silly
yeah.
stuff to try to like
Yeah.
argue that there's randomness there. I mean, besides the whole element of who gets to go first, right?
Yeah.
But with chess, because the mere fact that the information you're supposed to evaluate is so unmanageable, and the fact that you will have approached it in ways that are dictated by the randomness of your outside circumstances,
Mhm.
like I think it's actually a more straightforward argument with something
Huh.
like chess.
Okay. Yeah. Huh. That's really interesting.
But in any case, I think the task of managing financial markets is probably more like more like poker than it is like chess in any case.
Yeah.
Actually lived in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for quite a few weeks, as I understand it.
We all had this crushing burden of responsibility and this deep fear, whether the size of the problem exceeded our grasp, the reach of our tools, the reach of our knowledge, of our competence. That was a hard and terrifying time then because we were not certain whether it would work, and the world was pretty confident it wouldn't. And the fate of many things hung in the balance.
I was at Treasury, and President Bush came over to see me.
Part of the leadership is to kind of recognize what's happening on your team. And it was pretty clear that Hank was working himself to near exhaustion. So I tried to go to Wendy, his bride, and said, Wendy, you gotta get him to rest. I don't know if it had any effect, but at least he had a friend, me.
I said, well, if you really want to know what I'm concerned about, I don't want to be Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon was Herbert Hoover's Treasury Secretary during the Great Depression. And he laughed, and I said, well, what's so funny? I mean, no one knows him, they know about Hoover.
The country has got to have confidence in the government's ability to stave off a crisis. I learned that firsthand on 9/11. That one of the jobs of a leader during a crisis is not only project calm, but project confidence that we'll deal with the situation. And lo and behold, my administration started with a crisis and it ended with one. There will be ample opportunity to debate the origins of this problem. Now is the time to solve it. In our nation's history, there have been moments that require us to come together across party lines to address major challenges. This is such a moment.
In terms of getting the TARP, there were 3 or 4 sticking points. But one that was very big was compensation. Congress said, if you're going to do something for Wall Street, they should be willing to sacrifice.
The issue was, are people going to keep their bonuses while we're bailing them out? There had to be some Old Testament justice for the sins you committed that we're all asked to pay for.
When you go that way,
What a bizarre way
no
of
bank
thinking of this.
will take capital or take help from the government.
I mean, I think there's like, maybe not the best way to put it in comparison to the Old Testament, but I think, it makes sense that if we are, financially bailing you out because you're too big to fail, we still want you to see some of the consequences that you would from normally having failed, right? We're not bailing you out because we don't want you, just all the bankers at Goldman Sachs to not, have to go home and sell off one of their yachts. We're doing it because we don't want the entire country to come down. But it's not fair for you to get to sort of avoid all the personal consequences just because you happen to be so, uniquely important to the country.
And I guess if the safety net that's undergirding those institutions is perceived as overly reliable, then it kind of removes the incentive for them to behave in lower risk ways.
It's also just the case that I think, we want the safety net we want the safety net to catch us from going into economic Armageddon, but we don't want that safety net to be ensuring that, the CEOs still get their bonuses on top of their huge salaries. Um, and I know that
Yeah.
and I think this documentary goes over it, but it was a big deal at the time that, people, because, they it wasn't, entirely fixed, this economic crisis. There were still people that suffered greatly. And meanwhile, the government's program was paying for, like, special retreats and bonuses and stuff for these CEOs. And that was really, I mean, people were really pissed off about that.
And I don't blame them for being pissed off
Oh yeah.
about that. Yeah, it's
Yeah, I mean, if you're sitting there, your house is been, destroyed in value, you're gonna have to sell it for, pennies on the dollar, and you're just gonna have to, go move in an apartment, and then the taxes that you pay are being used to pay for some guy who has like a house in Malibu, for his bonus. I mean,
and it might be the same guy whose
yeah,
risky decisions imperiled your house to
yeah,
begin with. Yeah.
in the first place, who set up a lot of this crisis.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's that when you look at a person like that just gets uniquely screwed over, there has to be some sort of like comeuppance, whether it's like for the person that caused the problem or support for them. I think it's actually a lot really analogous to like trade deals that cause there to be specific sectors of the economy that lose out. Government policy should always prioritize, the most good for the country, but you need to make sure that people that get uniquely screwed over have some sort of some sort of like gimme. Um, and if you don't, I think you can see what starts to happen where, like, key areas like the Rust Belt that are, at the very least perceived as being very damaged by specific trade deals, even though I don't really think that's actually the case. Those people vote and become very motivated. And it's very important that you don't lose those people.
Yeah, so I guess the steel man of the Old Testament justice thing that Rahm Emanuel was saying a minute ago, it might be that um if there is no Old Testament justice, then we risk having a system where people behave with impunity
Yep.
in ways that I don't know, that damage the entire system, and which also are gonna which not only put the system at risk in the first place, but which also generate a bunch of resentment when that risk materializes.
Yeah, it's like we are sitting here trying to prevent, Goldman Sachs from going. We need Goldman Sachs not go under. We don't need you, Mr. Investment Banker, Vice President of Risk Management, to we don't need you. We need this bank. Um, and when you are part of the reason that we're here in the first place, you need to face some sort of consequence. At the very least, we aren't going to be, not just shielding you from consequence, but now like ensuring the benefits that normally you get for making the correct decisions, when in fact you've now made the wrong ones.
So I remember a lot of people saying at the time, like if these institutions are failing and if the effects are kind of trickling down to the rest of us, where all these people are losing their homes and so on, then a bunch of people at the time were saying like, why don't we bail out the homeowners instead of bailing out the institutions? And while I'm not very convinced that that would have been like a materially good solution to the problem at hand, I wonder if perhaps they could have done both. Right? Like for example, when COVID hit and the government was just sending out checks to everybody, right? You can
Mhm.
imagine, like, what if in the midst of the 2008 financial crisis they said, "Look, we're going to bail out the banks, but we're also going to bail out, Wall Street and Main
Mhm.
Street," or something like that. Like, I wonder if that would have had any significant effect on the way that people had perceived it in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it would have had an effect. I just think, the reality of the sort of reality on the ground is that many of these mortgages were unsustainable. People got mortgages that they should not have. And in many instances, investment banks were using predatory practices to give people loans or mortgages that they shouldn't have. Because it's important to remember, I think a lot of people don't realize this, the bailouts were loans. With the expectation to be paid back, and they were. I think TARP made the government multiple, like over $10 billion in profit, and at this point, they've all been paid back. That probably would not be the case if we were bailing out individual, because a lot of the reasons why these were failing is because they couldn't pay in the first place. Um,
Right.
and so that just probably, and it's also just the case that it would have been a lot more money to bail out Main Street and all those individual homes than to bail out, the financial institutions whose value was underpinned by them, um, in terms of needing to sort of alleviate them in the short term and then recoup those profits later or investments later.
Yeah, so had it been like a full bailout of all those homes, I pretty much agree. Like, I doubt that that would have been a manageable thing. Had there been some kind of like relief payment or something, right?
Yeah.
Because I know the perception that came out of all this was, look, the government is really only cares about Wall Street. It doesn't care
Yep.
about the little people, and like, look, they're willing to bail them out, but not us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a huge it's I think that so many of the problems that we have to deal with right now are all just messaging and imaging problems where people think that things are way worse than they actually are. People just think a bunch of things that just aren't true. And these become like accepted fact. There's a really interesting piece in the New York Times about a week ago that talked about how the economy is actually doing a lot better than it is perceived to be. And we're sort of entering this new territory where in a lot of respects, the economy is really good. I mean, unemployment is super down, wages are massively up. I mean, no doubt we are dealing with a lot of inflation, but even taking that inflation into account, the economy is doing like decent, but the perception is that it's doing absolutely horrible. And there's sort of this question of like, well, what do you do when like you've done everything right and it is working, but people still don't buy it. They just don't see it. And people start to enter almost these like artificial worlds of descriptive realities that just aren't true anymore. It's really scary, I think, because I think the like end conclusion of that being like taken all the way is like, stuff like January 6th starting to happen a lot more, where there are just these huge divergences on reality over things that are really, really important. You know, if some people think the economy is doing worse than it actually is, that can be bad, but that's not end of the world. But when people start to think that, oh, actually this deadly pandemic isn't that deadly, or the election was stolen, these are things where a house divided cannot stand.
Yeah, so so this, I think, goes back to the problem with incentives that we were talking about like an hour ago, right? Because if um if your success in politics is determined by the general mood of public opinion, as it's going to be, and to the extent that we're a democracy, that creates incentives for people to try to steer public opinion in one way or another, and everyone who's out of power, who perceives themselves to be disadvantaged by the status quo, has an incentive to steer public opinion negatively, right? Like, they want
Yep.
people to be unhappy with the status quo, so as to overturn it.
Yep.
And
And I think people themselves even sometimes almost have this perverse enjoyment of thinking that like, oh, the world is doomed and stuff like this. Like I think doom scrolling is almost intoxicating for a lot of people.
yeah, for sure. I mean, and at minimum, like, even people who aren't actively enjoying it are still susceptible to it, right?
Yep.
It's like driving by a car accident and you can't look away, that kind of thing.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's like the thing where you always remember one insult more than like 100 compliments.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Unless they're ready to fail.
They couldn't get their head wrapped around the idea there'll be some public say in private sector pay. What do you mean you would tell the private sector who could get paid? and we looked at Hank and Ben Bernanke like, what do you mean you want $800 billion? You know, we're not the ones that said the Lehman should go belly up. When you needed $30 billion for Bear Stearns, you figured out where it was. What do you mean you want $800 billion? The pay was an acknowledgement that you had messed up.
Hank's first job was to work out a deal on what the parameters of the TARP legislation would be that we put on the floor. Sometime well after midnight in one of those sessions, I recall receiving a call from Leader Reid, who said that Hank had just thrown up into a wastebasket.
I was in a little cubicle, and I got the dry heaves, and I make a lot of noise. And so Rahm Emanuel immediately came in.
He has, you know, I wouldn't call it chest pains, anyway, whatever. I think it was, he had some breathing issues. Senator Gregg and I are with him.
Rahm and I didn't know that this was real. And I said to Rahm, said, well, let's get the doctor. Hank Paulson said, no doctors, no doctors. I know, I've been through this before, it's okay. I
looked at Greg and we both said the same thing, which is, this is never gonna come out of the room, because if it ever got to the market that the Secretary Treasurer was, I don't know if it was a panic attack or whatever, but had basically a challenge breathing. The market couldn't handle it psychologically. So there was a blood oath between Senator Gregg and I. I never told Nancy, never told Steny, never told anybody.
Apparently a statute of limitations on that blood oath.
Yeah, well, I think at this point we're sort of well and over. Yeah, but yeah. I mean, it's crazy to think about how sometimes it's just a couple individuals, and Rahm Emanuel goes on to then be the chief of staff for Obama throughout his first term, and then eventually the mayor of Chicago. So yeah, it's just sometimes it's really crazy to think of how small the political world sometimes is.
Yeah, and can you imagine like how crazy this is in like a traditional kingdom or like an authoritarian state? Like if the leader has some kind of crisis like that, like
Yeah.
how huge the ripple effects are.
Yeah, I think it's an acute vulnerability of especially places like Putin's Russia, where, your position is very much dependent upon doing exactly what Putin says. And there's this real question of, man, we don't know if Putin has anyone legitimately competent around him anymore, or at the very least, people willing to be competent. People that are willing to say, "Hey, you messed up here." And yeah, it's just a total black hole.
And even a competent person can make mistakes, right? So
Yep.
so it's like the more you just centralize authority to a few people, like even if Vladimir Putin is a smart guy and makes the right decision 90% of the time, those 10% of mistakes that he makes, if there's no one there to stop him and check him,
Yep.
then the consequences of that are just not something that I would want to accept.
It's a huge problem, I think, in China as well, where, China for the longest time after Mao was an authoritarian state, no doubt, but it wasn't like a North Korea type dictatorship where it's just one guy. But then, Xi Jinping comes in 2011, and then in 2013, I think is when he amends the constitution. And now it's very much like Xi Jinping has this stranglehold, right? There's no longer this like healthy political body of the Chinese Communist Party, which at the very least, was, always evil, no doubt, but like had competing interests and stuff. Now it is very much like a weird one guy controls everything. No one step out of line or he'll fucking get you. And who knows what is going on there. I remember there was I read a great article about how that sort of examined this, and how there was this huge turmoil in the Chinese stock market, particularly over tutor companies that tutor kids, because Xi Jinping sent out like a one paragraph memo about how like he was like dissatisfied with the fact that there was like this evolving two-tier system in education, where it's basically like rich people can afford tutors and that's an unfair advantage. He sent out this one-page memo, and immediately the tutor market like fucking collapsed. Like there was this huge drop in like the stock prices and stuff of these things. And man, it's just like when you have like these nations that are entirely dependent on one person, that's a really scary place to be in, especially when it comes to their replacement, which is a whole nother can of worms. Like the day that Putin
Succession
dies, or the day
crises.
that the day that Putin dies or Xi Jinping dies, I mean, that is going to be an inordinately scary day for the world, because there is no plan, especially in China. I think the body that is supposed to choose the replacement for Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping is the only person on that body. It's normally like 7 other people. All 7 positions are Xi Jinping, I think. Um, yeah, it's just, I mean, it's crazy.
And on top of that, I think there's only like certain personality types that would even want to be a dictator in the first place. Like I think most people would be too afraid of the consequences of their own actions to even want,
Yeah,
like I wouldn't want an entire country of people, like walking on eggshells around me and just having their well-being, rely on my beneficence every day. Like
yeah,
this sounds like a nightmare to me. Like,
the system starts to select for a very specific kind of ruler, which becomes a successive sort of self-fulfilling prophecy.
yeah. But whereas like our system, like as important as this one guy was who was having this health crisis, I mean, we're able to withstand it, right?
Yeah.
Like even a president having a huge crisis isn't as bad. I mean, it's still very bad. We do have a lot of centralized power in the presidency, but for example, when Nixon was
Yeah.
going through his whole Watergate thing, and apparently he was like drinking all day and just drunk at the White House. These are the reports that were coming out years after the fact. um, the consequences of it were manageable, honestly. Like
Mhm.
compared to the consequences I would imagine if Xi Jinping were just getting drunk every day.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Trump is another good example where we definitely could have. I think our institutions buckled, but they didn't break under the pressure of Trump. There are definitely some things that are exposed as like these should not be unwritten rules. These should really be written rules. There are definitely things like that. But overall, I think we actually managed to weather the crisis quite well, all things considered. The concern is, what happens in round 2, if there is a round 2, where
Yeah, I was
Trump
gonna
gets
say,
back in
like,
the White House.
I sort of think it's too soon to say whether we've weathered the crisis well or not, but we haven't yet collapsed, and
Made it 4 years at the very least, yeah.
so far so good.
The implication being if we didn't solve it, we'd have Secretary of Treasury maybe passing out or something worse.
That was not a tactic, but if it had been, it was the best thing that could happen, because it was amazing how quickly we got together and had a deal.
Good evening. For the last several hours, the chairs of our committees have worked with Secretary Paulson and others from the administration to resolve our differences so that we can go forward with a package to stabilize the markets, most importantly, to protect the U.S. taxpayers. We write the bill and we bring it to the floor, and we're coming up to the day before the vote, and I said, I never lose a vote because I know I have my names. I want to see your names. The president said, they have to vote for it. Of course they'll vote for it. This is an emergency, yet they have to vote for it.
Small businesses, mom and pop grocery stores don't get this break. When they make bad financial decisions, they go out of business. But the rich and famous Wall Street, New York City fat cats expect Joe Six-Pack to buck it up and pay for all this nonsense.
It's pretty clear Republicans were for it. I mean, there was a lot of anger. And I didn't come to Washington to bail out Wall Street, I didn't either, but, it's necessary.
Under this plan, ultimately the federal government will become the guarantor of last resort, and Madam Speaker, that does put us on the slippery slope to socialism.
I remember talking to Senator Kyle and asking him how his constituent calls were going on the TARP. And he said, well, it's about 50-50, 50% no and 50% hell no.
If I didn't think we were on the brink of an economic disaster, it would be the easiest thing in the world for me to say no to this.
John Boehner had warned me. He had said, Hank, when you're looking at the House Republicans, you've got to remember 1/3 of them are knuckle draggers. Another third of them are in danger of losing their seats at this election and believe they're likely to lose their seats and don't want to take an unpopular vote. So you're fishing in a small pond.
Stand up for the American
taxpayer. Reject this bailout and vote no.
I went into Hank's office and said,
Yeah, it's funny,
look,
people
the
who
speaker
show
brought
up.
this up for a vote. They wouldn't do that if they didn't have the votes to get it over the top. And so we're watching it and watching it and watching it, and nothing's moving, and it's 212 to, just hovering.
It was a classic political vote. It was a bad vote if you were a conservative. It was a bad vote if you were a liberal. So the rank and file members went in, assuming that their leadership had the votes to pass it. They went in early and they voted no. They left and they couldn't be found.
The yeas are 205, the nays are 228. The motion is not adopted.
The stock market has moved lower. The Dow Jones Industrial Average down almost 500 points.
I was watching the vote on television and watching at the same time, watching the stock market falling and falling and falling, and saying to myself, the whole U.S. economy is at risk, and Congress can't get it together to take the necessary action to help us stop this crisis. I was very unhappy, very disconsolate.
Not the last time that
We
sentence
knew it was going to be a
will
close
uttered.
vote, but the Wall Street is extremely upset.
The Republicans abandoned Bush. I don't think Boehner and Blunt knew that they couldn't deliver, but I do remember walking over to them and putting my finger right in John Boehner's chest. I said, you better fix this, and you better fix this fast. I said, this is your problem, not ours. We tried to help.
We need everybody to calm down and relax and get back to work.
The primary issue for the market right now is fear.
I always thought I planned for the worst, but I just assumed with all the leaders on board, naive me, I've been in Washington for a couple of years, but I assumed it would pass.
Part of that was also every step of the way, that we would have half the votes and they would have half the votes, because we believed that this had to be bipartisan.
It was very, very deflating.
I remember Hank called me that night and his voice broke and he apologized to me for, he's owned this sense of failure because he was unsuccessful that first vote. And I remember saying to him, I said, Hank, you'll get this passed. We're the United States. We'll figure out a way through this.
Hell yeah.
We need to work as quickly as possible. We need to get something done, and I'm going to be continuing to consult with congressional leaders to find a way forward to get something done as soon as possible. We need to get something done.
Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 777 points. That is the biggest point value loss ever.
The first iteration of TARP goes down, and the market corrects by 1.4 trillion, which is kind of the ultimate focus group.
Facing increasing pressure from shaky markets, Senate leaders pledged to pick up the pieces of the $700 billion bailout.
Josh and the team came up with a different strategy and ran it up to the Senate, Congress again, the Senate the first time.
The time to act is now.
If we fail to act,
Can we pause for a second?
gears of our
I wonder if the immediacy of the feedback that they can get from the stock market kind of gives it is one of the reasons why it has such a heavy weight on policy, right? Like the fact that if they could fail to pass a bill and then just see the next day that the stock market has crashed, it just seems like that's gonna just the recency bias of that, or it's
Yeah.
gonna weigh more heavily on their minds than any like long-term effects that are harder to perceive.
Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that this vote was coming so close to an election as well. I think it is another example of sort of the unique pressure that the different pros and cons were weighing. Where on the one hand, the pro of stopping this, you're getting immediate feedback from the stock market, but on the other hand, you also have that immediate, coming up of a vote when a lot of these people were going to be were up for election coming very soon. It is, I think it's a classic lesson in like power politics, where ultimately these representatives are going to be doing whatever it takes in order to stay in office. They're going to be voting for whatever is going to get people to support them in their reelection a lot of the times, and how that can really play havoc sometimes when you need to make an unpopular but necessary decision.
It just seems like the short-term incentives greatly outweigh the long-term incentive for both of those cases, right?
Yep.
Like one in the stock market and two in the election. Because it seems like they're pretty much always concerned about the next election, which is at most 2 years away. I suppose for a senator, it might be 6 years away at most.
Yeah, people have short memories.
But if they're making policies that are going to affect people 30, 40 years from now, and there just isn't really any built-in incentive in the system, for them to consider that, that's a little bit troubling.
Yeah.
Our economy will grind to a halt.
The Congress started to hear from their constituents what's happening to my 401k, what's happening to our economy. Then that led to a reversal.
The yeas are 74 and the nays are 25. The amendment is agreed to.
If the second vote had gone down, I might have found myself a cave someplace in the head for a while.
We literally passed a bill to send a signal to the markets and the financial. Here's $800 billion. We'll figure it out later.
So how did Wall Street react to the big bailout? The Dow actually closed 157 points lower.
So then, while we were getting this legislation in Congress, the situation worsened. We had the two biggest bank failures in U.S. history with Wachovia and Washington Mutual, WAMU.
In the last 5 days, the Dow has fallen more than 1,800 points and 18%, the biggest weekly decline in its entire 112-year history.
We needed something that was going to work much quicker and be more powerful. We had various capital program ideas to put capital into banks. And we had our teams working around the clock figuring out what would work. So as we were working this through, on Saturday night, I was exhausted. I fell sound asleep. My phone rang, and I answered the phone, and he said, "Hank, this is Warren." And my mom has a handyman named Warren. I'm saying, why is he calling me? But it was Warren Buffett. He laid out the idea, which was a germ of what we did.
I made a suggestion around the beginning of October of a way to do it where I thought the government would come out doing very well. I actually thought that it might make more sense to try and put more capital into the banks than it would to try and buy these assets. So I actually sent that along to Hank.
Hank came to me and said, what we just passed in Congress isn't going to work. I said, you got to be kidding me, man. Now you tell me. His plan was now to give the money directly to Wall Street. He said, it's the only shot we got. I said, we're going for it.
Mr. Mack, time for a comment? Tell us what you'll be discussing today.
You have some time to chat with CNBC.
You want to tell us you're here to meet with the Treasury Secretary?
Nope, sorry.
Can you tell us what you'll be discussing today, sir? Mr. Knight, can you tell us why you're here today? Can you tell us why you're here?
Columbus Day weekend, after TARP had passed, Hank convened the heads of the major U.S. banks at the Treasury.
I walk in and there's 9 of us lined up there. And on the other side, there's Hank, Ben, Tim, a bunch of other officials. And they said they have an idea. They want us to take this TARP money. You're 25 billion, you're 10. On this basis, they calculated roughly 2%, I think, of risk-weighted assets. They also fully knew that some people did not need it, and there were a couple of people in that room who needed it.
Nobody wants to publicly take the money, because if anybody takes it, then the market says, well, they must be terrible. Let's pull everything out. So it actually was quite an important decision to twist arms and force everybody to take it.
He was very tough. If you don't take it and you need it later, it won't be a 6% preferred. I'm going to take your firstborn. And I fully understood.
I don't like to be heavy-handed.
That's an argument that people use for UBI
some of the things.
What do you mean?
Well, the idea of UBI is that it replaces a bunch of means-tested social welfare programs, right? And the fact that those programs are means-tested is in itself kind of an incentive against people signing up for them, because it's like admitting that you need help.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. That's a huge problem.
I saw people in government do that I thought was abusive. I really believed we needed to do this for the good of the system.
He had this document, and I said, well, give it over here. And I signed it,
and flipped it back across the desk.
Wow. Look how short that is. I think that's what, like,
And flipped it back across the desk.
yeah, right there. That's it. And just crossed out name of and read it Morgan Stanley. That's
insane when you consider that like Congress is just passing these bills that are like hundreds of pages long, and this one's like not even a page.
yeah. I'm trying to see here. Does it say how much money it is for in the amount of 10? I guess that's just supposed to mean 10 billion, maybe. Or
Is that
yeah.
really what it says? It's so hard to read
It
it.
says major financial institution participation commitment in support of the U.S. financial system and the broader U.S. economy. The Morgan Stanley agrees to issue preferred shares in the amount of 10 to the U.S. Treasury under the terms and conditions of the TARP capital purchase program announced today. Participate in the FDIC program guaranteeing new issues of eligible senior liabilities by banks and bank holding companies and transaction accounts as announced today under the systemic risk exemption invoked by the FDIC, U.S. Treasury, and the Federal Reserve. Expand the flow of credit to U.S. customers and business on competitive terms to promote the sustained growth and vitality of the U.S. economy. Continues to work diligently under existing programs to modify the terms of residential mortgages as appropriate to strengthen the health of the U.S. housing market. So yeah, I think that sharpied in 10 up there inside the brackets is the 10 billion that they would have gotten, that this particular bank would have gotten from TARP.
I mean, this is literally almost like writing a check, right?
Yeah.
And Vikram said, aren't you going to go to your board? I said, no. When the Secretary of Treasury tells me that we don't do this and we get in trouble, I'll get punished, that's all I need to know. And I said, look, if I get lucky, my board will fire me. I'll get out of all this craziness.
Yep, and then yeah. So that was the 10 billion. Yeah, here's the one for Citigroup, 25 billion.
Oh, you know what? The brackets made it hard to read before because they wrote the 10 in a way that okay.
But yeah, no, it's the same picture. It's the same one printed out, and then they just write in the name of the company, the number of billions, and then they sign.
Wow.
He can describe it to you later, okay?
Try not to steal any more money.
The press had been all over the place. The mistake we made is in walking out, they tried to talk to us, and every one of us, brushed them off a little bit.
Did it go well? How did it work out here, man?
And so the headline the next day said, not only were they bailed out, they were ungrateful.
Trust your banker. Give us your blank check.
I'm here to oppose the bailout plan because it's a massive transfer of wealth from working Americans to elite institutions and the super wealthy.
Give us your firstborn and your blank check.
Hank called and said, I got him to take all the money. Plus, I think 700 other banks around the country. It's probably the greatest financial bailout ever. The intervention, I think, saved depression, but I can't prove it.
Yep.
I mean, I can talk till I'm blue in the face at the Rotary clubs in the heartland of America and say, man, we stopped the depression. And they'll look at me and say, no, you spent our money to bail out Wall Street.
Yep.
We have to dig in our pocket.
I think there's still many people who believe that we bailed out companies and helped Wall Street because we were trying to help our friends in the financial industry and not out of our interest in defending the U.S. economy. That's absolutely not true, but I think I have to live with that.
I met the then Democratic nominee, Obama, in New York in late October, maybe a week or two after the TARP thing. And I remember saying to him, we'd broken the back of the panic, but it wasn't over yet. It's going to take a bunch more stuff still.
Barack Obama will become the 44th president of the United States. It's been a long time coming. But tonight, because of what we did on this day, change has come to America. Let us remember that if this financial crisis taught us anything, it's that we cannot have a thriving Wall Street while Main Street suffers.
The fever plateaus, but it doesn't break. We didn't know how fast the economy was contracting. The foreclosure rate is skyrocketing and there's no end in sight, so we're going to have a housing strategy.
For even as we celebrate tonight, we know the challenges that tomorrow will bring are the greatest of our lifetime.
We've got at least 5 institutions that are bombs, ready to go off at any time. Welcome to the White House.
I had been talking to Barack Obama on a daily basis, and the TARP had become stigmatized. My credibility was going fast.
You seem to be flying a $700 billion plane by the seat of your pants.
I was looking forward to, after the election, to hearing from him and getting support and backing and so on. And instead, I heard from one of his transition team members, guess what, Mr. Treasury Secretary, you've had your last conversation with the president.
More big-name companies made plans to shed workers.
A bank that got billions in free money from the taxpayers then turns around, cuts off credit to a local business, and then won't authorize workers to get a penny upon leaving with 3 days' notice. We're outraged.
The 9 weeks between the time that Barack Obama was elected president and when he was sworn in, it was holy hell.
Circuit City will go out of business, cutting 30,000 jobs.
The nation's unemployment rate bolted to a 14-year high.
We did slow the panic or stop the panic, but the system was very broken at that point, completely frozen.
Automakers are back on Capitol Hill today, seeking a $34 billion bailout.
We're looking at the need to keep the auto industry from imploding.
We pray that you would remove the veil between the people of this nation and the people in authority.
But Barack Obama had the political courage to do what was right and do what the public didn't want to hear. All the money came back with a $50 billion profit, the money they put in the banks and the insurance companies. So when you look at how the U.S. economy recovered, you know, growing at 2% for the third quarter of 2009 on, our system worked really well. So the TARP capital program is the most successful program that is broadly hated in the history of mankind.
We had a dinner at the Federal Reserve for, to say goodbye to Hank. Clearly, it'd been a really tough time for him, and I'm sure he was relieved that he no longer would have the responsibility. But we knew that we could still count on him and that we could call him and talk to him.
As stressful as working for 18 months during the crisis, the first year I was out of government was the hardest period by far for me. I sort of sat on the sidelines with my heart in my throat. But I look at it now and I say, wow, policy continuity.
President Obama, we first met in late October, and at the end of our meeting, he said, I might need to ask you to come work with me in Washington. And I was deeply reluctant to do it.
He encouraged me not to do it. He said, Mr. President, you don't want to bring me on. I've been on the front lines on this thing. Maybe what you need is a clean break. But I trusted Tim as someone who was a technician, who was non-ideological. He was my best bet.
Good morning.
Ultimately, if the president asks you to serve your country and you believe in him or her, it's a hard thing not to do.
Today, Vice President-elect Biden and I are pleased to announce the nomination of Timothy Geithner as Secretary of Treasury.
We did a whole range of things to keep the mortgage markets open, lower interest rates, help people refinance, help people stay in their home.
President Barack Obama is rolling out the next step in his multi-pronged plan to revive the U.S. economy, a $75 billion program to help struggling homeowners.
But if you remember the public debate, there was a huge opposition to bailing out the homeowner, too.
This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. President Obama, are you listening?
It's a famous rant by Rick Santelli, which a lot of people view as the beginning expression of what became the Tea Party.
You work for us! You work for us! Let's stand together, let's stand with honor, let's restore America!
The Tea Party begins with the announcement of the housing program. And they say, this is all for deadbeats and rewarding people who don't deserve it. We should form a Tea Party.
I was not surprised by the public backlash because a year after we've spent $1 trillion+, people are still going to feel worse. And all they see is that there's a whole bunch of money going to the folks who perpetrated some of these terrible things.
Financial crises are often followed by populist reaction, but I think it's important to understand, though, that there's some very long-term trends in the United States, including the stagnation of wages, the reduction in upward mobility for people, lack of opportunity. There's a whole number of things which have contributed to the present moment. Financial crisis didn't help that, but it obviously exacerbated some underlying tensions in the United States.
Two of AIG's former CEOs were grilled about a retreat where only a week after being bailed out by taxpayers, its executives spent $440,000 on oceanfront rooms, rounds of golf, and trips to the resort spa
Not a
and
good look.
salon.
They were getting their manicures, their facials, their pedicures, and their massages, while the American people were footing the bill.
One of the worst days I had came when we learned that AIG was contractually obligated to pay bonuses to some of the people in the financial products division. And I knew that was a catastrophe, and there was going to be a huge problem politically.
American people had to bail out AIG, but most Americans still lost 40 to 50% of their retirement plans.
If we had not made that action, they would have lost 70%.
I think it was clear it was going to be fraud. At the core of the challenge was, again, is this basic thing about fairness and morality. How do you figure out a way to protect the public interest without creating a whole bunch of private beneficiaries?
Did the people who took out insurance with AIG to insure their retirement plans get reimbursed 100% so they suffered very little loss? Yes or no? Not one of you three can give me a yes on that answer, or no.
Because it's a poorly posed question.
The fact that the American public hates what we did is not surprising, because in many ways it's un-American.
Several hundred people packed into Bowling Green Park in Lower Manhattan for what they're calling an Occupy Wall Street demonstration.
People are definitely getting screwed over right now and getting hurt by a lot of the powers that be, and we want to see a change in that.
People struggling to pay their mortgages, incomes that haven't gone up, all this strain, and people at the very top walking off, acting like their shit doesn't stink.
Since 2000, you've taken home more than $480 million. Are these figures basically accurate? I would assume they are.
And that whole attitude is that people think that there are two rule books, one for the elite and one for everybody else. And that started off populist revolt.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the United States, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
The fuse was lit in 2008, and Donald Trump was the explosion. He's the result of the financial crisis.
There's a lot of Washington lobbyists, bureaucrats, politicians who don't want to see things change. That's because we're going to take care of this country for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And we're not going to let people come into our country who are going to destroy our country. When do you hear that?
Crises breed populism. And yes, economics go along with politics. And if one is broken, the other gets broken. And it's going to take very strong leadership to bring this country together, because we're very polarized.
USA! USA! USA!
have to worry. I'm not going to read a prepared speech. It's funny, but not that funny, right? I think perhaps because we were so different in our own ways. We had different skill sets, we had different personalities, we had different experiences, but we trusted each other. And so to me, I look back and I don't know how we would have ever got through it if I hadn't had these guys as partners.
I remember looking at my wife's face in the morning when she read about something we'd done, and like watching how I could not convince her that really that was as best we could do. That was the best we could do.
We designed a strategy that was effective in getting the economy growing again quickly, and people thought we gave hundreds of billions of dollars away to the banks, which they paid themselves in compensation, and the country lost those resources. But in effect, we designed a strategy where we forced them to pay for that, and the taxpayer earned a significant direct profit. But I don't think that's enough for people.
At one point, Michelle Smith came and said, you need to have a town hall with the staff. People are coming up to them in the grocery store and saying, what the hell are you doing?
I guess the thing that makes me a little more optimistic is that we've shown in the past that when there's a real threat, whether it's a 9/11 or a financial crisis or a war or whatever it might be, that we can come together, and I think we will if that does happen.
And remember, we were lucky too.
I believe this documentary did come out before COVID, just as a something to note.
Financial resources large enough to really do anything. Not many countries have that privilege. Really fun to see you all again, although it's kind of painful too.
Yeah, that is very unfortunate.
I just caught what you meant by that. When you said that was unfortunate, at first I thought you meant just, it was unfortunate that COVID happened after that. But then I realized what you.
I mean, that too.
The quote where he goes like, "Yeah, well, but whenever there's a big crisis, we'll all come together to solve it." Like, perhaps not.
Yeah, I think the now like I don't remember like what I don't remember what the time period is on this, but like every couple of years we have to run the game of chicken on the debt ceiling.
Yeah. With regard to the COVID thing, I had this conversation that was pretty interesting with a friend of mine. Pretty soon after COVID started, and this guy, I guess, was a fan of Watchmen. And apparently, I haven't even seen or read Watchmen, but apparently one of the themes of Watchmen is the idea that humanity needs an enemy, so that way, like if we all unite against a common enemy, then it'll bring us together and stop all our squabbles or whatever. And then I think that idea was kind of put to the test when COVID happened, and it didn't work so well.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm pretty philosophically illiterate, but I think that's like one of the central ideas of Schmidt, of the philosopher Schmidt, who, worth noting, was like the crown jurist of the Third Reich. So, definitely a great demonstration of how having a set enemy can be quite horrific.
Yeah, and apparently doesn't necessarily even accomplish what it's supposed to accomplish. On top of the more obvious problems that it poses to the enemy. Yeah, I actually don't know almost anything about this person.
hmm I only know about him from debate because this is a really stupid. This is the kind of arguments that would happen in debate. People would be like, "Yes, I'm going to read the Schmidt K. We need a define. You're going to solve racism. Well, that's bad because we need a defined enemy." Stuff like this. Yeah.
Like seriously, so I remember you saying that like people would run these strategies and debates where they would try to make like a left-wing critique of the opposing argument and say that like your argument is invalid because it comes from this position of capitalist privilege or something like that. But is this the kind of argument that you would see on the other side of that? Is that the
I don't.
idea?
I'm not sure. I think I'm being probably a little hyperbolic, but I don't think I ever actually saw someone run the Schmidt K. It was a very like something like the Cap K, the capitalism critique, was very standard. It wasn't rare to see at all. I don't think, but the Schmidt K was kind of infamous insofar as being like this weird off the wall. Like I don't think there was almost anyone that actually seriously ran this.
Like it was a joke that people would
Yeah, it was.
threaten to do it, or
Yeah, I think it was more theoretical than anything else. I don't even know what the actual like links were. Um, but yeah, no, I just want to look up. Yeah, ProRepublica, the bailout checker. It's actually $109 billion in profit.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, even more.
Well, thank you for bringing that documentary. I had actually never even heard of it. I don't even like watch movies or what. I never watch TV and rarely watch movies, so
Mhm.
it was interesting to come across it. Do you have anything else you want to say about it in closing?
Yeah, I think this is just it's a great demonstration. I wish more people could watch this because I think it's a great lesson in uh what our institutions are actually like. I think this is a great like corrective piece to correct a lot of the misnomers that I think we will have about our institutions and the kind of distrust that they have, that the documentary touched on many times. Also, God, I wish the other Vice and HBO stuff was nearly as good as this. For anyone else who saw this and was like, "Oh, this is amazing," I wonder what other things is. They're not bad. They're still good, but they're not as amazing as this. I had the exact same thing when I watched this the first time. Although, if you do want to watch educational documentaries, super recommend. I'm gonna kind of be spoiling uh how I know a bunch of anecdotes, but Unreported World, these guys do some great documentaries.
Hello and welcome to the Unreported.
Highly recommend if anybody else wants to watch some knowledgeable pieces of reporting. This is on topics that don't get covered that much. Very good reporting, and some of them are pretty short as well. So you don't have to sit down and watch for a full hour. Watch the one on one of these on double speed. That's 10 minutes. You're in and out.
I guess they're mostly like social issues. Is that what they're
Mhm.
about?
It's just the idea is it's just issues that aren't being covered nearly as much as maybe they ought be. That's sort of the whole gimmick of Unreported World is it's these guys. I think they're from Channel 4 in the BBC. But the point is they're like a real professional news team doing reports on things that don't get very much international attention.
Are they doing like investigative journalism as part of this, or?
I think for the most part it's just reporting as opposed to specific investigations.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna. I've never heard of this either, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. Well, yeah. Do you want to shout yourself out before we're done? Or-
Yeah. What's up, guys? My name is Flowtrace. You can check me out at twitter.com/Flowtrace_. It's twitch.tv/Flowtrace. And every Wednesday here on Cricket's channel, twitch.tv/CricketStyleJ. I am most found on Twitch Politics, panels, Prime Ks, Wick, somebody online. Yeah, that's just about everything for me.
All right. Well, in that case, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Flowtrace. Thank you to everybody in the audience, and we'll see you next week. And I'm about to raid into Not So Erudite.
All right. I'll see you.
All right. Later.